Hey guys, welcome. Can we all get seated now? I'm Meg King with the Wilson Center Science and Technology Innovation Program. Thank you for being here this morning. We are webcasting this because we anticipate an insightful conversation with an impressive group of experts. Thank you for being here. We wouldn't be here today if it weren't for our global fellow, Tim Weir, who, in addition to being one of the Center's fellows, he's currently a principal in his own international risk consulting company. He has extensive senior leadership experience that encompassed ultimate responsibility for overseeing the protection of over 450,000 personnel and billions of dollars in assets in more than 120 countries, while a managing director with Accenture. He was a committee chair at the U.S. Department of State Overseas Advisory Council, a past chair of the Conference Board's Council of Security Executives, and a graduate of the FBI's Domestic Security Executive Academy. I didn't actually know that. That's impressive. He's also a life member, serving over 18 operational years in Montgomery County, Maryland, with his local volunteer fire rescue station as a lieutenant. Tim, why don't you give us an introduction about why we're here today? What is Bits and Borders? Why do we need to talk about the intersection between physical and digital security? And then we'll open it up to our panel.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Meg. And welcome, everybody, both on the webcast and here in person. The forum in particular around Bits and Borders, traditionally things have been defined at the atom level. You could stop goods and individuals leaving borders. You could inspect them. Countries could have rules and laws. If you think of it as the analog town square, if people gathered, there were rules about decorum and behavior. In the bits world, the digital town square could be, as my friend Bruce Mackenday likes to say, from Seattle to Shanghai. It can be a forum where it's no longer open to multiple views. It could be people of similar beliefs inciting and increasing dialogue that's either a false narrative. It can be destabilizing, as we've seen with events that are occurring in the world right now, leading to protest. It can cause reactions to companies. I think many of you, and there's a lot of recent examples, see what happened with China on the Twitter. These have implications beyond just what we traditionally have seen with governments. They're impacting companies. It goes to the Sony hack, the First Amendment, our most important amendment, free speech, all the way through to, we'll discuss a little bit about not just disruptive attacks, but destructive attacks. Traditionally, attacks have been disruptive, and they're moving to potentially areas that become destructive, requiring not just a cyber response, but perhaps countries looking at that militarily. And we can, in this panel, we'll talk a little bit about what we saw in Saudi more recently, where physical infrastructure was destroyed using technology. So that's the high level of what we were looking at in this particular area of bits and borders and the asymmetrical risk. And we'll look forward to, in these panels, having some deep discussion around this topic.
Thank you, Tim. Tim's going to moderate a couple of sessions later on. I'm going to moderate this one, and Evan Wolf, who's going to join this panel, this first panel, is going to moderate the second panel. So can I have Evan, William Green, Rob Kanaki join us up here? I'm just going to sit on the end.
Thanks.
Rob, good? Yep.
Linda's going to sit in.
Oh, good.
How are you? See you, Chris.
Hi. Chris Olson, how are you?
Hi. Chris Olson.
Sorry. Sorry, thank you. Oh,
I think you're on the...
Oh, thank you. I'm not,
you're welcome to join, Chris.
Get coffee and sit down and enjoy yourself.
Okay. So I'm going to start with William. William Green founded TD International, a leading global intelligence advisory firm in 1999 to help clients navigate the complex and opaque business environments in which they operate. With 3 decades of private and public sector intelligence experience, Mr. Green provides discrete strategic and tactical guidance to C-suite executives and global investors operating in emerging markets. His expertise includes developing international and regional business strategies, building commercial intelligence platforms, cybersecurity, and managing clients' business risk. Rob Kanaki, I'm jumping around at the end, is the Whitney Shepherdson Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a senior research scientist at Northeastern University's Global Resilience Institute. Rob served from 2011 to 2015 as Director for Cybersecurity Policy at the National Security Council, and in that role, he was responsible for the development of presidential policy on cybersecurity and built and managed federal processes for cyber incident response and vulnerability management. Evan Wolf is a global fellow at the Wilson Center. He is a partner at Kroll & Mooring in the cybersecurity practice, and is both a geologist and a former sysadmin and a jack of all trades, and we're really excited to have you here, Evan. Thank you. Now, Linda, I actually don't think I have your bio, and I apologize.
No problem.
Will you introduce yourself?
Yeah. So my name is Linda Greenstone. My name is Linda Greenstone. I am an associate director at TDI with William Green, and I am a former federal and state prosecutor and a retired criminal court judge from New Orleans.
Oh, from New Orleans. I'm impressed. So our first panel today is, what is the line between a company and a government to prevent and respond to a cyber incident? Where and when does a matter become national security and a company yields to the government or multiple agencies that may engage? How do these governments coordinate their efforts? Who wants to start? Evan?
I guess I'll start. Just because I'll say the things that people agree with most. I mean, right now, I think the line, or we have, as a physicist would describe it, there's sort of a fractured interaction between government and industry. Ostensibly, government is responsible for all things offensive, and they're the only ones that can do things like, gain access to foreign systems without authorized access. Industry is not allowed to do that because of laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So that means industry can just sort of sit and wait to have an incident and wait to be hacked, and then they really can't do anything, and they're predominantly responsible for defensive measures. And I think that is the biggest challenge we have, is we have this huge green space between offense and defense, and there's not a lot of interaction in between. And in some ways, as we've all seen with the losing season with the Washington Redskins, when you have an offense and defense that are, I have to make a swipe at the Redskins at least once a day, when you have an offense and defense that are completely disconnected, it leads for a really inefficient and fractured system. And I think that's sort of the operating environment we're in right now. I think this not only hurts government activities, as we see they're now forced to when they want to compel information from industry. They don't have a genuine partnership strategy, so they have to compel things using subpoenas and every now and then trading on sort of the goodwill, but that puts industry at peril. And so I think hopefully what we can talk about are some of the ideas to fix that, and to have sort of operational collaboration, which seems to be the sort of theme or the hashtag for the year in cyber, and I think there are other activities, but I'll just start off with, I think that's the nature of where we are right now.
And if I'd like to add one thing to that, from a recent experience that we've had at my firm, a large component of the private sector has no clue who to reach out to. I mean, there are institutions within the government that you can deal with, but as a general statement, corporate America, in spite of the fact that they might have a cybersecurity team, they don't know where to go or who to talk to if they're confronting a problem. So the lack of knowledge in that space is really quite remarkable.
How is that possible today? I mean, what are the reasons? Are they structural? What are the reasons?
I actually don't know what the answer is. I would suggest that most corporate structures are set up to make money. The amount of money that a lot of corporates have put into the cyber side has been relatively small. If they haven't had a problem recently, well, they don't worry about it. It's almost like an insurance policy, right? Why am I paying insurance? I don't seem to need it yet. It's when the problem does occur that their hair's on fire. They don't know where to go or what to do. And so they reach out to anybody that seems to have done anything in the cyberspace or any place else, or relationship with the government in any capacity. So there's a large need for education back out to the private sector. Yes, it's partially their fault, but the government, I think, should be doing more to integrate or to educate them on what they need to do.
I've actually seen, Evan does, and he did it for the program we run for congressional staff, tabletop exercises, and basically analyzing a data breach and who does what. And it isn't intuitive, but it's still remarkable that business still doesn't know who to call. Rob, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about where that dividing line is and what the roles and responsibilities are. And I've been working on a formulation for a little bit now that I think may be clarifying. What we've seen lately is that very well protected companies are causing adversaries to come and do close access operations to seek out insiders, right? They've gotten their cybersecurity so good that Chinese espionage actors, and in some cases even Russian actors, have been forced to come into country and to carry out operations there with the goal of getting data off systems.
Is this sector specific? I mean, or is this more cross sectors?
We've seen this with nonprofit organizations, we've seen this with financial organizations, and we've seen this in R&D heavy organizations. I'm going to say that this is a really, really good thing. Even though the adversaries won't stop, you've now created a problem that the FBI can solve for you. So I think that that's the divide. If I was going to say, what's corporate America's responsibility? You take care of the cybersecurity to an extent at which your government can actually step in and do something. If you can draw your adversaries out of their cyber safe havens, you've done your job. That's when government can take over.
But is that real? I mean, so you mentioned a few sectors that spend the significant amount of money on cyber. So is that really a sustainable model for every company, every mid and small sized business that has five people and a computer to be able to spend that kind of money, that we really have to worry about sort of Chinese wet teams coming in country? And that's my concern, is that now we're in sort of the great spending race, and how is that sustainable for industry, and is that really industry's responsibility?
So I think on the first point, I think there is a degree to which there is a match between adversary capability and target resources that sometimes does not match if it is, say, a small NGO or something like that. But if you're a 5-person company selling yogurt in Portland, Maine, you're not going to be facing Russian adversaries. You're going to be facing ransomware.
What if you're a 5-person company in Portland, Maine, bending pipes, selling them to the Navy?
I think that that's one of those areas where we have a solution, which is called build those costs into your contracts. Evan and I could do this all day long, though, so you may want to intervene.
Well, I want to get Linda in here from especially as a former prosecutor, the legal perspective. And I want to throw out there the 4-letter word, it's more than 4 letters, but active defense. How do you think about that from a legal perspective? What tools can we give companies in the absence of this knowledge about who they can or cannot call? So how do you think about this from a legal perspective today?
I've thought about that, for instance, in the paperwork that Tim presented. So you have someone who is responsible at a corporation to know when a burglary has occurred in the building. And so you've got a set of rules on this is what we do, this is who we call, this is the standard operation procedures. What happens if you have a breach into your systems? And how do we hold someone responsible? At what point should you have known that it would happen, or in fact that it did happen? So we may not know for 6 weeks, 6 months, that there was some type of a breach of security. And so do we have rules for companies to say that there should be some type of tickler if X happens, there should be some type of tickler if Y happens, and there should be someone responsible within your office to determine if that in fact did happen? And so it looks like at some point we will probably require our IT departments to have far more responsibilities than they ever did, outside of just making sure that the computers within the office worked and that no one could actually get in. But what happens when it does? And then you have this whole other set of issues to deal with. Now we're in the courtroom, something has actually occurred, and what evidence can we present into a court hearing, worrying about authentication and
Other people's data.
Exactly, someone else's data coming in, and whether or not there was an expectation of privacy on this piece of information, if it was on the telephone, or if it actually did go onto the World Wide Web, and whether or not there was any expectation of privacy there. So there are a slew of issues that the government will have to at some point deal with in determining how we go once we get into the courtroom.
One other thing, as we begin to talk more about this, I mean, corporate America has a significant responsibility to be addressing their cyber issues. And so, as a starting point, it's not the government's responsibility to protect a corporate, as a general statement, from, various adversaries.
Unless they're critical infrastructure.
And well, even then, you can't say to, Oklahoma Gas and Electric, hi, I have no responsibility. No, they do have responsibility. And so what is the program that these corporates are putting into place? And as cybersecurity becomes a more important consideration for them, which it is very, very quickly, then they need to build out the programs for that. And so what does that take on? I mean, there are a lot of things that they can do that are relatively straightforward. And implementing that and understanding that this is an enterprise risk for them. And what does that represent in terms of the monies that they need to allocate? The problem becomes, as back to my earlier point, is when something does occur, who do they reach out to? How do they document that? What's the process for the handoff to federal agencies that might pick it up? And I don't think it's clearly delineated at all, and that's something that needs to be worked on.
Yeah, I mean, on this topic of governance, I completely agree with Will that even if you look at, let's take some of the sectors Rob talked about, like a defense sector or the financial services sector, if they have a significant incident, it isn't clear. They don't, a defense company doesn't go to the DoD CISO and say, hey, I have a problem. Actually, that's not the CISO's responsibility. They don't have the capacity to handle it. There are sort of parts of DoD, the Defense Security Services, that could help, but they're in that case, they view the company as a regulated agency. So we really don't have that governance infrastructure, and it's not only just in the tie between industry and government, it's even within industry. If you look at the chief information security officers, the CISOs with any company or with any sector, there's not clear roles and responsibilities of what they're supposed to do. If we compare them to CFOs, not that CFOs are the sort of high standard for any company, but at least we have a clear delineation of what a CFO's role is in terms of Sarbanes-Oxley, in terms of the board, in terms of financial reporting. If they do things that are go below those standards, that negligent standard, they get fired, as opposed to a CISO that gets fired just for a bad thing happening on a bad day, even if they were responsible or not responsible. And when we project this to a global setting, then we need to think about, well, who is representing these companies globally? We don't have a U.S. trade representative for cyber that's dealing with sort of these multinational state relationships. So as we think about the trade war that the U.S. is in with China right now, if we project this to what a cyber war looks like, if we overtly talked about it, there is no sort of body that serves the USTR function in the cyber world that could deal with these types of interactions. And so it's either dealt with, below the scene or not at all. And that's, adds to this problem of governance.
Rob, can you give us a lay of the land? What is DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, doing now? What is FBI doing? Just to kind of get some facts out there. How have they improved recently?
Sure. I mean, so I give, as an ex-Obama political appointee, I actually give a lot of credit to this administration for what they've done at the Department of Homeland Security on cybersecurity. First, they created CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. This is a massive, massive move, bringing cybersecurity up to the same level as FEMA, CBP, the Coast Guard, TSA. So we now have an agency at DHS responsible for cybersecurity. We've also seen budgets moving in that direction towards an agency level. So the smallest agency at DHS, I think, is about $3 billion, the Secret Service. CISA is approaching that, and I think, given current plans, we're going to see a lot more resources go towards CISA. So that's a very good thing. The dominant focus of the agency has been election security. That's been what the leadership's focused on. That's what the technical teams are focused on. And I think I applaud those efforts. The FBI, you can kind of follow the FBI in terms of what else has been going on with the FBI nationally. I think they were less focused on cybersecurity when they were enmeshed in the 2016 election, and now we're sort of seeing leadership focus back on the issue. We're still seeing things that disappoint me, where the FBI tends to get out of their lane a little bit and start getting into information sharing and protection efforts on a regional basis out of the field offices. So we still don't have those clear delineations between FBI and DHS. And then finally, the big one, Department of Defense. What I would say about DoD is I applaud the efforts to try and come up with clearer cyber war doctrine for when they will engage on behalf of U.S. targets and how. The efforts that they've made, I think, so far in terms of pushing out where they will target and what they will do, being more aggressive in this space, I don't think have really yielded the kind of results that people hoped that they would, that offense was going to be the answer to our defensive dilemma. It just hasn't turned out that way. I do think we need a much tighter link with them and with critical infrastructure so that, for instance, what was it, Oklahoma gas is our example. I think they need to have a direct link to the Department of Homeland Security so they could essentially tip and cue offensive behavior if they were receiving an incoming attack that they could not handle, and that was in the national interest to protect. But the last thing I would say on them, like the FBI, they seem to still struggle with what their mission is and how they're supposed to carry it out. They still seem to want to have that Homeland Security mission or a protective mission where they might sit, say, on the perimeter of a financial corporation and be responsible for swatting down bad attacks. I don't think that's a model that works. I also don't think it's a model that, if it did work, would be DoD's responsibility.
Taking it to the national security part of the conversation, where and when does an incident become a national security event? Is it just critical infrastructure? We saw with Sony that the line was crossed according to the last administration. So how do you all, from your perspective, think about that? Linda, do you want to start?
Certainly, the obvious answer is when there are a number of people who are at risk of being injured. Do you consider financial issue? Do you consider financial risk? Do you consider shutting down shutdown of utilities? Does that make it a national security interest? Or what about the potential of maybe only 10 people being injured? Do you say that is in fact a security risk or not? I don't know.
We don't, and I'm assuming we don't have the answers to that in government either. No.
I mean, I'll tell a funny story about the Sony incident since you brought it up.
Sorry.
We created something called the Cyber Response Group, which was at the assistant secretary level to organize all federal agencies for responding to cyber incidents. We had a whole protocol written out about how we'd organize, but also when we would organize. When did an incident hit the point at which the cyber response group needed to be called and formed? And we just stood it up when Sony happened. I went to my boss and said, hey, I think we should call a CRG on this. And she pulled out the protocol and looked at the criteria for when a CRG was called and said, nope, doesn't hit criteria, we're not doing it. 10 minutes later, John Brennan, who's then the National Security Advisor for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security, called down and says, I'm calling a civets, which means he was bringing it up to the deputies level. So it kind of is one of those situations in which it's, how does it look? What's the instinct? It's hard to come up with really clear criteria.
So I actually don't think it's, I think I agree with Rob in that, and just for the record, reflect that I'm agreeing with Rob on something, that we don't have it. I don't think it's that hard to do. And I think the three characteristics that we can use, and this isn't too different than how the courts thinks about things. First of all, I think if we want to really define what is a national security cyber attack, first we need to look at who the threat actor is. I mean, companies don't have, I work with a lot of pipeline companies, not a single one of them have a man-pads or anti-missile defense system, even though they, could be devastated by any, low-level Russian missile system, because we accept that CBP and DOD and everyone else is going to keep those type of missiles out of the United States and not attacking pipelines. So if companies are being attacked by purely, foreign military organizations as opposed to commercial organizations, that should be a national security issue. Whether it's a national security issue that has the escalation that Brother Rob was talking about is another issue, but that's a national security issue. Second is the type of weapons that are being used. As we recently saw, And I'll use the example in China. China used 5 0 days to develop a tool that was a weapon that was used to attack the Chechenian and some native populations, the Uyghurs in China. So if we see countries or even industry using what are sort of nuclear level weapons or weaponizing significant amounts of 0 days to attack companies can't be expected to defend themselves and shouldn't be expected to defend themselves about that. So I think that's the second criteria. The third is effect. And I think and this goes to what was mentioned earlier, if as when we were standing up DHS and we were thinking about what is critical infrastructure and what are the sort of, when we were looking at sort of events that had sort of a 9/11-like effect, we instantly threw out the 3,000 loss of life and $30 billion. And whether that's the level that we need to think about or whether it's, 2 loss of life and $100 million in cyber world, we need to come up with some line that above that, this is a national security issue. So I think if we look at sort of who the attacker is, what the weapons are, and what the effect is, we can begin to characterize and put together a framework of what is national security and not. I just don't think we've done that yet.
But what if the threat landscape changes? What if a government directs private sector entity to carry out an attack and we don't have enough time to validate that it was in fact government directed? What if it gets more complicated in there? Let's just say, I hate the term deepfakes, but generative adversarial network designed video out there and it's just chaos. What happens then?
Well, I mean, to start with, just because it's coming out of something that may appear to be a private sector entity doesn't mean that it is, obviously. And there are an enormous number of groups out there that function in that capacity, all right, working for state actors. And so I guess it comes back to the notion of what is being attacked, all right? Who cares where it comes from, where it's initiated? What matters is what's the damage being done. And I think that should drive whether it's a national security issue or not.
Right, which is why, to bring up the Sony case, it's just it was so unexpected to me that became a national security issue. I mean, I understand the argument, but, there wasn't loss of life. There was a significant business and financial harm. But can you tell us a little bit more, Rob, about, to the extent you can, why it was raised to that level by Brennan?
I mean, I think the instinct among leadership was that this was an attack on U.S. values. This was an attack on freedom of speech. I mean, that was a terrible movie, right? But it was speech, right? And so this was,
I thought it was funny, but okay.
This was an attack, right? That the president, I think personally felt he had to defend and say, this is unacceptable and we're going to take actions against it, right? It certainly didn't hit any loss of life threshold. I think the economic harm from that was relatively minimal, but ultimately it was a question of values. And when you're dealing with the internet, where so much of what happens there is really speech, it's not transactional, it's speech, I think I think it was the right call to say this is unacceptable behavior.
Well, even past the just being unacceptable behavior, when you're in an adversarial situation, you're trying to send messages equally, right? And so, okay, this might not rise to the level of there are going to be 10,000 people killed, but it goes against our values. And so you have to respond with some sort of message back out. Don't mess with us. Don't do this. Don't do that. So the give and take that goes on between governments isn't just by how many people are killed or anything else. It's these are our values. Don't cross this line. We're going to defend ourselves. And that's part of the messaging that was done in that instant.
Okay, let's tackle one last question and open it up to the audience. So what happens when there are multiple governments involved? How do we coordinate among the governments and with the private sector? And do we have an example? We could, hypothetical even.
I was going to look to our former DOJ,
Go for it, girl.
I don't know.
It can be hypothetical.
A hypothetical. Can I kick this one to you?
Yeah. So I mean, let me give a because if I were sitting in front of a judge, which I guess I'm sitting next to a judge, not in front of one, I would first ask what is the standard that's being applied to the case, and I think that's the issue. And we have a good example here that I forget it was a few Tuesdays ago that when the UN was meeting in New York, a group of 27 countries came out and agreed to an agreement on what a standard should look like and what the properties of a standard is. And maybe Rob or someone else knows the statement. It was about 2 paragraphs long, but it was 27 important countries coming to say that we need to have standards in this area. And I think that's the first thing that countries need to come together and do, is say, what is acceptable versus not acceptable. When the US and China entered into, I think it was a bilateral, and they agreed that we weren't going to, basically hack for commercial purpose, but continue to hack for government and military, which I think is a good dividing line in general of where states should continue to not cross over. But we need to have a clear standard, and then once we do that, we need to figure out how we're going to enforce it. As we learned in the environmental world, one of my favorite environmental treaties ever is the Ramsar Treaty, which enforces, wetlands around the world, even in countries like Iran. And because we have assets, we have remote sensing platforms that can detect when a wetland is still wet and when it's dry, and that's something that people, once you sign on to the treaty, there's no hiding around that. You can't put big tarps over a wetland and all of a sudden pretend that it's no longer a wetland. And so we need to figure out what is the Ramsar-like treaty enforcement mechanisms once we develop that standard. I think that's maybe a starting place.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that one of the developments that I've really want to watch very closely is the Cyber Peace Institute, which is an effort that I think Microsoft has really led to try and establish an organization that will be independent and call balls and strikes on government behavior in cyberspace. And I think that that's the kind of mechanism that we're missing. There's a series of mechanisms that I think Evan mentioned one. We've got some treaties in cyberspace already, some agreements in cyberspace already. What we don't have are very strong international mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement. And so, when I look at something like the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, it's very hard to tell whether that's been effective at all in creating better engagement transnationally on cybercrime issues, because we don't have an organization that sits at the center of it, calling balls and strikes, facilitating transnational cooperation.
Questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I'd like to question whether there's an analogy for a relationship between government and the fire marshal. Whether you build a refinery or an apartment house and open it up, so a fire marshal comes by. Should be something like that for any cyber system, whether it affects the public or not. If your apartment building burns down, even no one killed, it's still a public nuisance. Not quite as much as a refinery burning down, but in any case, you can't operate without a license. And I think cyber equipment is getting to that stage. Should there be something like that?
I think I would be a fan, especially since I have a 13-year-old son, of not letting anyone online until they have a license. And I would also age out my 82-year-old mother, whose computer is vastly infected, and I would remove her license, top rate any electronic equipment. But I do think there's an example of where this is actually coming to fruition, and that's in the defense sector. And so after the entirety of the defense sector, and I was working at the MITRE Corporation at the time, so we were included with pwned in the early 2000s. And basically, as General Hayden described it, the greatest loss of intellectual property in the history of the U.S., DoD sort of said we need to do a better job of protecting our intellectual property, our information that we use to make our munitions and weapon systems. And so they started down the path that's resulted in 2016 through 13 the development of what's called the DFAR safeguarding rule, and it fundamentally does what you say. They created a standard. It was used by NIST 800-171, 110 controls, said these are the things that if you do, things like multi-factor authentication, do you have strong access controls, are you encrypting your data on your network, that if you do these things, you can have our information and you can do business with us. And they're now actually elevating the game by introducing the cyber maturity model certification, where they're going to say under the CMMC program that you actually have to get graded by an independent company. And if you are a 1 through 3, and this is going to be sort of a go, no-go decision, you can continue to do business with us. And if you're not, you can't. And so I think that's a good example. The problem is, as sort of what we learn in government, is that what works in DoD only works in DoD. I don't know how we replicate that to the rest of industry.
The DOD, I mean, have they been less susceptible to cyber attacks?
So as a matter of disclosure, I do represent a lot of defense companies. So I would say it's working, and when it's still too early to tell. I mean, like Rob, I have a blind faith to all things DHS, and I think DoD will also likely get this right. I think we are having a better system of reporting that's not just a faith-based initiative, but actual reporting, and so I think we're moving along the process.
Even we haven't talked much about DOE and the infrastructure, the grid, et cetera. And Sean Planky is over there now, right? He's running cybersecurity. In some of the work that we've been doing, we found that there are a large number of utilities right now that are buying firmware and everything else to operate these systems. And there is a movement afoot to try to have that all not regulated, but verified, that the equipment can't be impacted by a foreign adversary, et cetera. So, I mean, there's a plan even over at DOE right now to start looking at doing this in a larger way, so that there's a stamp of approval, a good housekeeping certificate that can be given to some of these manufacturers of products that go into the infrastructure.
Next question? Yes, sir. You want to use the mic?
Interesting discussion. One of the things that it sounds like in listening to this, it's just kind of my perception listening to the comments, is that there's sort of still a split between private sector and government, and it's rather than a cooperative one, it's sort of well, you do that. No, you have to do that. And it brings to mind back when the DoD tried to get companies to cooperate by passing information to the government about cyber attacks, and private sector severely fought that, lest they give away any private secrets about their own cyber status or their processes inside and so forth. And so at least the DoD in that case was unable to get the cooperation of the private sector to provide the information that would have helped the government figure out policies and procedures and tactics and so forth. One, to counter attacks, and two, to identify and therefore be able to respond to attacks. And so I'm just curious if anybody has any ideas on how to get government and private sector working together rather than sort of independently saying, oh, no, you ought to do it. No, you ought to do it. Excuse me.
The first place is just to begin a dialogue back and forth. So that dialogue is pretty weak right now, I would argue. And so you're not going to get a long way immediately with it, but you start the dialogue. People become more comfortable with each other, et cetera. Relationships are built, and those things begin to happen. If there's some sort of financial benefit to them for having run through a program of certification with the government, that would be advantageous to them, and they would probably do that. So there are ways to achieve it, but it's going to take a bit of time. It's not going to happen overnight. And there's a big, my experience anyway, is that in the corporate space, there's a great desire to have more dialogue back and forth on these issues. It's just, who do we talk to? How do we go about it? It's just not well known.
To be clear, it's been 15 years.
It may have been 15 years, but
And the companies have resisted.
yes.
I mean, I want to add to the point of company resistance. The Department of Defense analogy only can be taken so far to other sectors because the Department of Defense contractors really only have one client, one customer. When you talk to companies in IT, for instance, in digital media, most of them, the first thing they will say to the government is, I know you think we're a U.S. company, but we're really not. We're a multinational company. And so there's a lot of resistance to anything that looks like cooperating with the US government or being brought behind the cloak, the cover of the US government. And so you don't see in a lot of sectors a willingness to share information, to collaborate, to want to work on defense with the private sector. I don't know of a solution to that other than I think the growing reality in much of the private sector that you're either going to be in the Chinese market or you're going to be in the US market and not both. So stop worrying about upsetting the Chinese.
Other questions? Yeah, right there.
You mentioned needing more dialogue in terms of corporate. How would that work interagency? You mentioned the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense as well.
You know, I unlike a previous panel we had with two former bosses and heroes of mine, I don't think we need a Department of Cybersecurity. I sort of, once again, in the unique world, actually agree with Rob that CISA, the Department of Homeland Security's agency, really should serve as the central agency to convene. Much like after 9/11 and after the reform of the intelligence community, we created DNI to coordinate all sort of foreign foreign threats to the United States and coordinate that function. CISA can serve that role. That's why we stood up the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. We realized there was a gap in how we thought about domestic security, and we focused on aviation security for the first, I guess, 18 years now, and now we're beginning to have that focus on cybersecurity, and DHS should be, and is the right convener of that domestically. I don't think we at least until they fail, we need to give them the authority, which I don't think they have, and we need to continue to give them the budget, which we're beginning to have, but they need more of it to do the job and then hold them accountable.
I can just chime in on that. They actually just stood up with the DOE, DHS, their own.
So just for the people online, Bryson Port commented about the fact that there's an interagency control system working group that DHS is leading, which is another example of where, you know, if we give them enough time and you know, DHS is still a 18-year-old agency or an agency that's sort of has experienced 18 years of life 1 year at a time, and if we give them enough time, they should be able to mature into this mission, I hope.
One last question. Yep, Jeremy.
So going back to the transnational exchange of information, most large private firms are multinational, you know, whether it's software, hardware, firmware, you know, anything in between. And most exchanges, even on the software development side, are not necessarily transactional, you know, just going one way. So looking at standards, multinational standards, I think is a good starting point. What do you guys feel about, or what are you guys' thoughts on like collaborative governance opportunities between nations or between groups of nations that are dominant players in some of these spaces?
One of the things I've been advocating for is that as we start to recognize the splitting apart of the internet into 2 or maybe 3 different internets, that we start structuring that in such a way that Western democracies and other democracies really that value free trade, free enterprise, the free exchange of ideas, come up with a common set of governance structures among them to enable and allow the flow of data, of ideas, of commerce, essentially a digital trade pact among these countries that would exclude countries like China, Russia, and others that don't want to play by those rules, and hopefully create something that would be attractive to them to change their evil ways. So I think absolutely coming up with new governance structures internationally is essential.
Last thoughts? Then we can move on to our next panel, if not.
I'm all for Cyber NATO, so.
Well, thank you very much to our first panelist, and we'll welcome our second panel on how have responsibility shifted up to the front of the room.
No.
Glass of water, except you're testifying in front of Congress. I have no recollection.
Okay. So new faces. I'm not going to make up new bios for people, and we'll get, since we have people online, I will introduce people, but then get started with the questions pretty quickly. Immediate to my left, we have Chris Olson, who's the CEO of the Media Trust, and Media Trust, and I'll let him talk a little bit about it. In some of his answers, is a very unique company that focuses on removing sort of really the heart of removing malware from the World Wide Web that's focused through advertisers and third-party code and introduced in that company. It's been 15 years now developing and sort of fighting the good fight. Next to him is Paul Kunis, who is the senior director at Accenture, who works responsible for all things cyber. He has, if you think about Accenture, with 500,000 plus employees and 120 plus countries. If it was a federal agency, I always describe it, it'd be the third largest federal agency, and the network that Paul is responsible for defending is immense. And he works with, I think, one of the better CISOs in industry, at least longest standing CISOs, if that's a sign of success. And then we've heard from Tim Weir, former Chief Security Officer at Accenture. And then moving along, Bryson Bort, CEO of Scythe, which is a startup company that he started after working at a defense company. And prior to that, he's a West Point grad with 8 years in the Army, hacking on our side of things. And also started recently, before that, had started and is still running a successful services company called Grim, which if anyone wants to refer to him by his hacker name, it's that as well. And then last we have Anatoly Chudovsky, who's the VP for business head at EPAM Systems, which is a software and engineering company. So moving along and building off of the momentum from the first panel, we really want to talk about, how has the responsibility shifted? I mean, cyber, this is where, as a partner in a law firm, I can look at some of my trade lawyers or some of my tax partners, and every now and then they have these sort of punctuated moments where, the whole world and tax code changes. Not really, but where they have to do things differently. But I feel like in cyber, that's like Monday or Tuesday when everything changes and we need to think about things differently. So I'd like to start off by sort of, what from the industry perspective, since we have a sort of industry-heavy panel, which I'm very happy about. What do you think companies are doing differently in the horizon or of the last few months or few years? I don't want to think about this in terms of decades because that's not a useful piece. But maybe starting off with Chris, from an infrastructure perspective, how are companies sort of changing what they do, and what is it that they are doing?
So from the media side, and we put media in context of digital assets, I think websites and apps. What we're finding with the advent of GDPR, burgeoning CCPA, is that companies are now forced to consider the consumer. So it's kind of a strange idea to put the golden rule onto companies from a cyber perspective, because we've been trained to protect ourselves, to protect our own companies. But rules and regulations are starting to change, and what that means is that Google and Facebook and others, not to mention all of the attention they're getting in the media for all of their bad practices, is forcing them to modify. So historically, as Evan mentioned, we're 15 years old. We've been watching the manifestation of better and better targeted malware for that period, with the idea that a company is just worried about itself. Most of that malware delivery skips the company that's serving it. So it's moving out to the consumer, to an entity that would be visiting the asset. And so a huge shift that's really just starting, somewhat forced and somewhat also in the best interest of the entity, is that they have to start thinking significantly about the consumer. As with the environment, the FDA sort of cliche, comparisons with cyber, I think as we get better at understanding our impact on others, and we start to wrap that into how do we secure our whole environment, that's going to kind of lift all boats and get us into a better place.
Any other comments on that? And maybe moving down the road, maybe Paul and Tim, you can talk about sort of what's happening within companies in terms of shifting both responsibilities and actions, and what companies are doing, differently on a year-by-year basis to sort of think about what their responsibilities are and sort of manage them.
Yeah, sure. I think it's dependent, on the maturity of the organization and where you're at, where you've gone, and where you're going, as far as your posture, your cybersecurity posture. A large organization like Accenture, we were able to, really concentrate on cleaning up the environment and getting to a stable state. Once we did that, we continue to educate our management and our C-level on the impacts, the possible impacts of a cyber incident. And then that helped us drive accountability throughout from the top down. And so we've done that. And now it's a regular conversation, and it's a key conversation that we have now from the board down of what our cybersecurity posture is. And we move from just having a posture of having the right controls in place to understanding what our resilience is. And so when we talk about our resilience, it addresses that changing threat landscape, right? So we have to measure that on a regular basis, and then we have to shift to that, right? We expect things are going to happen. It's a matter of, can we mitigate, the impact of that quickly and turn the corner. So far, we're able to do that. Smaller organizations don't have that capacity. They don't have the understanding of what to do when an incident occurs, perhaps, or they might not even know that an incident has occurred. I think there's very much a dependency on third parties for these smaller organizations, but there has to be an expectation from their clients, their customers, and the government on what they need to do.
Yeah, and I'd echo, Paul, what you're saying. Being in the industry for almost 3 decades, coming out of school, the function was definitely in the back office. 9/11 was one of the game changers that moved it to the front office. It certainly got a new level of attention and budget. And I would argue today, with the transformation that's going on with cyber, it's certainly in the head office. The boards certainly know who their directors of security, their CISOs. The accountability is elevated the function, and I don't think that there's any going back. And I think that's a positive amongst many of the negatives. And then the collaboration that's occurring between business, CISOs, CSOs, and various agencies has improved greatly. And to kind of echo what Linda was saying, that there is more guidance coming as to what constitutes evidence. Companies are looking at the P&L, not trying to make cases, but in some instances, like William said, you have to send a message that there are ramifications for people that do things, either at the nation state or at the employee level, and then across that board. But at the end of the day, still, even though AI and other things are happening, the FBI doesn't arrest computers. They arrest people. It's still a people issue. And we have to not lose the focus that automation brings new opportunities, but we still have to manage this in a people realm.
Other components that are changing, I think, are the multinational companies that are doing business in China now, and other geographies. I think, as I sit here and I listened to the first panel, heavily involved with, trying to decipher the new China cybersecurity laws, et cetera, on the impacts of not only what we do, but what our clients do. It's, we're talking about, do we have the right understanding, the accountability within our corporations, most of them central, that leadership maybe in the U.S. We understand, I think, in a mature organization, who to contact if there's a breach in the U.S., but what if you're setting up this component of your business in China and there's a breach there? It's going to impact your reputation, et cetera. There's no really, I don't have an answer for this, but there's no clear line of who you're going to work with within that government. So just another iteration of what we need to worry about and things that we're thinking through today, that a lot of organizations that, just want to do business in China because of the revenue are probably not considering some of the smaller organizations, obviously.
And I would argue in some cases not who you're going to work with, who are you not going to work with. I mean, the vetting that, I mean, William knows this, and the Bureau has been very helpful as other agencies. In some cases, you don't want to invite additional poor actors or bad actors into a very complicated situation. I'm sure, Bryson, you might have a view on that as well.
Oh, inviting the fox into the hen house? I mean,
It could be, do you have a choice?
do you,
at
well,
some
do
point,
you have a
right?
choice? I mean, that's. I mean, we're talking about China just do an operation there. It's. I mean, what security? You've. they legally require access, and so the first thought that came to my mind when you were talking about reporting that was whether they even care. Because I mean, what they're going to report on themselves? I mean, they're not going to do that. Going back to the broader question. In my experience, there are two kinds of companies. There's companies where the leadership cares about security and those that don't. And no amount of professional talent, technical controls, policy, or anything is going to change. If the leadership doesn't care, nothing happens. And I'd say the biggest understanding that I've seen for companies is now recognizing the risk of their supply chain. And this, I think, should sound obvious to everyone in the room, but this is a relatively recent understanding that our risk is no longer just our own. Our own business is not the sole owner of that risk. It's distributed. It's shared. That whole supply chain, those partners have access into your environment and are more often than not the access vector for getting to your intellectual property. Now, start to think about that supply chain. The supply chain is rarely, another Accenture. It's small business. Well, guess who's below the cybersecurity poverty line? I'm going to quote Wendy Nather there. The cybersecurity poverty line is this concept that these companies have no chance. They don't have the resources, let alone the understanding to do anything about what the problem is. And they're a part of your risk. And then somebody here was talking about resilience. The reason we're focused on resilience is in effect because we've given up on being able to do anything else. We're going to continue to be surprised. So at least we can respond quickly once we figured out what happened. And we've seen the statistics. We usually figure it out how long? A year later? Then we start to react. And then the final piece I'll pull in here while I'm the doom and gloom guy, is that consumers, because we're all now in this interconnected world, are consumers that go and buy all of these cheap Chinese products that are what? Always interconnected to everything. So they're great access points. Well, those are our employees, and they bring those devices into our environment as well. So you now have this proliferation of poorly engineered equipment that comes into your corporate environment, which is an effective walking back door that your own employees are accidentally bringing in. How do you control that? What do we do? And I start to look at that as a societal problem, not just an individual problem for companies.
And to look at the supply chain as well, if you think about where consumers touch digital, so bring it up to not a corporate concept, but where everyone, right, our grandparents and our kids are leveraging digital and it's sort of influencing their lives, that supply chain is predominantly what the company is bringing to them. It's very little of what the company is actually writing themselves. It's not their source code. It's not their infrastructure. It's not even their information. It's often not what they're writing about. It's third and parties that are part of the supply chain that are impacting everyone. And so when we get to corporate responsibility, I think the ideas of this being similar to an environmental conversation is that until companies realize that they have no responsibility, not just what's brought into them, right? And that is what we're trained to think is, as a CEO, I think about what's happening to the media trust. But as companies, we need to be thinking about what we do to the consumer and our partners as well. Most of that isn't actually what we do. It's what we bring to them via third and fourth parties.
And I guess I would be stating the obvious, but the humanity spent entire history creating physical borders, right? And brainstorming how to protect my asset, building the castle and whatnot, creating the government, creating the country, creating the nation. And in 21st century, we pretty much forgo all of those things, right? The borders are open. And we're wondering what to do with it because there was no precedent, right? And I think the cybersecurity starts on the behavioral management level because it's so intangible and so invisible. It's about the awareness of your employees and your customer, what could happen and what to look for in order to get that awareness of that attack, not a year from now, but maybe tomorrow, right? It's all about creating the governing body within your company, as well as to have a federal laws and state laws. And I think the PII and GRC, it's a good start. At least we are on the same page when it comes to cybersecurity. And then again, I think the chief cybersecurity officers, they're not very well equipped because we do not have that standard, federal standard, if you will, or whatever international standards that we've talked about, 30 minutes ago. If they would exist as any other standard, or like you said, the internet to conduct business and the internet to conduct pleasure, we've seen nothing yet, but those are good ideas. Because right now we all commingling on that highway, commerce, defense, government, right? And how to decouple and create the safeguards for the future generations. That's the question.
So I fear that borders are coming. We've already seen China establish its border. Russia just started to test their own digital border. And so I think it's, I don't know, perhaps ironic with history that we see totalitarian governments being the one to evolve and drive for their own purpose, the very digital borders that we sit and argue about them being so open.
The walls are coming back.
The walls are coming back. Digital walls. I don't know, New Berlin Wall, what are we going to call that?
So if I could take back control of this panel, which is much like, herding my cats at home. And I guess I want to pick up on something Bryson said, and if there's any question of where he got his hacking name Grim from. You've seen an operational explanation of that in the doom and gloom, but I think it's very accurate. But when companies make the shift of, especially at the C-suite level, that we want to take responsibility for this is something that's important to us. I think he's spot on that there are sort of this very defining moment when, usually led by a CEO or sometimes after an incident, or sometimes when they see that this is going to be a business issue that they need to manage. But for whatever reason, when they've made that shift, what are the things, and I think you all from each of your perspectives have a different idea of what companies do when they sort of start going to the light of better security, better governance, better infrastructure. Can you, just to make this sort of somewhat practical and helpful to companies, talk about, and I want to start with Chris, who's sort of at the leading edge of what can companies do to protect their everything from their consumers to people that just go through their, go to their electronic territory on their World Wide Web, regardless of, what country they're in or where they're viewing. What are the things companies do when they decide to make that shift?
So what I think, and also echoing back onto the supply chain. So knowing those third parties, and then fourth and fifth parties that are being brought into their ecosystem, and then moved back out. So over 15 years, unfortunately, what we typically see is they get hit. A hit usually means a brand experience versus a massive temporary loss in public value or something like that usually winds up coming back. Many firms that get hit become cyber security companies, and start promoting those types of services. But barring that economic impact, it is usually something that happens to them, and then something that they're forced to respond with. What we do see them starting to understand, and this is in e-commerce and media, so think where people are typically going, is that they start to understand that if you want to visit China, you just go to a big media website, you refresh a page or you refresh the app, and instead of you actually deciding to go visit them, that tourism is coming to your device and application. And then to understand, so when we look at borders, rarely are we deciding to travel somewhere where that country is coming to us, right? And typically without the knowledge of the company that we're visiting. So as they put together the interaction between the digital asset and how the consumer or the customer is touching that company, and they understand that that's a place where there's significant brand risk, but it also ultimately would be significant security risk, they start to put that into context of their larger security platform. So that's a big shift that we're seeing.
Yeah, I'd say that, overall, it's a new level of due diligence in what we do up front when we look at what business we enter into, what business we acquire, what business we perform on behalf of a client. So, and I think that aligns well with the supplier risk management programs that are in place these days. And I think it aligns back to a question of certification, right? So we understand that we have legal but also ethical responsibilities to protect client data and protect ourselves, right? And I think through a mature program, we drive that into some of these smaller organizations. We have a choice to select who we do business with. We should require certifications, third-party validations of those organizations, et cetera, and be able to tier and look at them differently based on the criticality to the work that they're doing, the data they have access to, et cetera. But that takes time. And I think certain industries can do that. I had some time before I came back to Accenture at a law firm, and that precisely happened. We had the financial services institutions pushing really hard on law firms to up their game in cybersecurity, even driving them down the path of what the requirements are. And I think I saw that 5+ years ago to have a profound effect on the legal industry. So I think it can happen. Also, from a point of resilience, where I don't think resilience is where you go only just because you don't have a choice. I see resilience as having a really good posture and be able to protect today, but then being able to move and kind of leapfrog where the threat is evolving and going. So if you have a really good, mature organization, you're able to have that threat intelligence, understanding not only what's happening to yourselves, but what's happening externally, and then you can learn from that, and then you can change your program as you need to, changing threats, changing geopolitical issues, changing the threat landscape, et cetera. You need to be able to apply that and move your game forward as the bad guys move their game forward.
And I'd jump in on the point, Chris, that you made about going across digital borders and inviting an app from another area. And I think of the Apple commercial. Today, more information is on your phone than in your home. Most of you left today and you probably locked up your home. But are you thinking about what you're doing, and are we thinking organizationally what we're doing with these devices that contain a tremendous amount of corporate information? Depending on your job, it might be customer or some confidential information. And are we practicing the good hygiene when we look at where we're downloading apps? Are we doing the due diligence and understanding that across the digital border, the information is more vulnerable than ever? And shifting that mindset away from the atoms into the bits, where even employees leave the organization in the evening or fly somewhere. What are the safeguards that we're instructing and ensuring that they understand when they're out there on those digital borders, exposing both the organization and themselves? And we know that the embarrassment levels are high. Paul and I are not going to go into details, and Evan has many cases, but to quote a mentor of mine, Dr. Gerald Post, the second largest river of life is denial. And many of us are floating on that. When you get phone calls from people saying, I can't believe that this particular message I got for an extortion attack has some of my photos. I mean, to me, those are yes or no questions, not, I'm not sure. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I'm not going to comment on blackmail. I am going to challenge the comment you said that it's on the phone, because it's not on the phone. It's on the cloud.
That's true.
And the cloud is
Incorrect.
AKA just someone else's computer. So I forgot what the original question was. I have my notes, but
when companies, and it's really picking up this point, there are two kinds of companies, ones that have leadership that have decided to engage and not engage. And when they've decided to engage in cyber and they've decided to be ready, what are the things that the companies are doing? What can they do and what are they doing?
Sure. So first of all, they actually fund the security organization. So this is that graduating moment from, hey, we have 2 overworked sysadmins to, we're now going to invest in people to have a security organization. That sounds trite, but there are thousands of companies that are in that position or not even yet in that position. And tie that back into where we hear over and over again how short and small the talent market is. They can't even hire them. So what do you do? And this is where there's been the large transition in the cybersecurity industry, I think, to automation, because we're trying to work with more, with less people behind it. And so with that investment, earlier we mentioned how folks follow best practices like NIST, et cetera. But the biggest thing that I've seen that ties that together is where the reporting goes, right? The reporting now goes on a regular basis to the board. The board's involved. That shows the company's priorities. And so tying it through to the leadership's involvement, when you can see where security is reporting in the organization and how often and how serious those conversations are, I think that just tells you a whole bunch more that follows from it. And sort of a shout out, I think, also to that same degree, I think that's the reason like a company like Security Scorecard has been successful. At the end of the day, what I think Security Scorecard does is gives you colors. You're yellow. The board understands yellow. We all psychologically understand, well, yellow's not green. What can we do to change that? And what we've done is we've been able to abstract all of the nerd talk to a color. Because the board doesn't understand the details, the technical details, and they don't have to. They just need a simple way for the IT folks to interface that something needs to change, or we need more, or we need less. And it all sounds really simple, but I think it just comes back to that psychology of we can now have a conversation that we can understand, and then we can do something about it.
And
I think to the points that we're making, it's almost desire out there for us to have a cybersecurity certificate, for God's sake, to conduct business, because time and time again you are walking into the existing customer, and they go, sorry, we cannot conduct business with you anymore because of something. And they go, what happened since last night? And they go, we've been told there is a report floating out there. So again, a lot of information is up to different interpretation. And it's very hard to conduct business and predict that business. So if there is such a thing as a cybersecurity certificate, like William said, good housekeeping certificate, it would be nice to have, right? And I'm sort of appealing to my business colleagues because it becomes very hard to talk to counterparts, even though they're very qualified, they're chief security officers. But since there is no standard and the only governing body is a board who sees yellow, everybody goes, it's yellow. There is no business for you, no soup for you, come back tomorrow, maybe, right?
And to echo what Bryson said, it's not just the putting it on paper, it's the actual practices. And I think Paul knows this, there is a tendency right now in certifications to say, I'm certified, I'm okay. And it is a report card, it's a good hygiene, but it doesn't necessarily mean you don't have problems, but it's the practice. Are you practicing what's on paper? Because I have seen organizations where the org chart looks great, but you go out for a beverage with the security team and they're not getting the speak, as you say. And then secondly, and I think, Paul, you would see this with clients and the like, everybody is certification happy right now. And they hang these things on the walls, and some of the, as Evan, you could probably attest, some of the bigger breaches have been with some of the companies who've got some of the best certifications. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're safe, in my opinion.
I'm traveling to Brussels tomorrow to get a certification and my picture taken with it, so I can attest to that. But you're right, unless you practice it. I mean, all of the breaches that we've talked about or you read in the paper, those organizations have certifications. And, but, you know, one thing can go wrong, or you can get a certification and just, you know, by the letter of the law, right? But you haven't practiced it, right? And I was going to save this for I think one of the panels a little bit later about how stress testing it. But right, I mean, there's astronauts. I don't know. I'm going to try this analogy for the first time. You have your astronauts, right? And they're peak physical performance, and they're ready to go mentally, et cetera. But you don't just send them up into space. First, you put them in that centrifuge, and you whip them around, and they get the G's. And if they throw up, they're probably not going up in space. So you got to stress test your systems and make sure it's not going to throw up, even though you thought it looked really, really strong. That's my best analogy.
Yeah, no, I'll follow up on that. So, cyber vomit. Okay, you heard it here first.
Hashtag cyber vomit.
Hashtag
is now
cyber vomit. No, so there has been regulatory requirements, which regulatory requirements are operationalized as checklists, right? Check, 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 check. breach, check, 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 breach. And the transition is to maybe I need to do more than the law requires. Maybe I need to do more than the checklist, right? We need to throw you in the vomit comment. We need to see what happens with not just the performance stress testing, but being able to measure detection and response, aka resilience, and do that realistically. That's more than a checklist. And it's also the difference, because as a consultant, you get the clients who come to you and be like, what can you do for $5,000? Shake your hand and give you a cover page. Like, versus we want you to do an extensive adversarial emulation. We want you to take that threat intelligence, model it, and apply it to our environment and see what actually happens. And the biggest thing I like to point out when you get from that is everybody focuses, again, on the nerd solutions for the nerd problems, aka technical controls. Your largest surface area in your organization is not the computers. It's the employees. It's the people. They're the ones who come in and day out, and you might have multi-factor authentication, and they figured out how to defeat it because it's just annoying. You need to understand that. You never, ever will get that from a checklist. You only get that from operational stress testing. So cyber vomit only shows up when you really grab the doggy bag and go.
And being a
Chris, I'm hoping you'll save us from the whole cyber vomit.
I'm very sorry.
When's breakfast?
I'm the third-party risk person here. So another thing that I worry about with our customers is an over-reliance ahead of getting hit on legal agreements. So if you get hit, call Evan, please, immediately. Don't speak to anyone else. Call him first. Before that happens, I think today you have to make a decision that all of these neat contracts you have that suggest that liability is on someone else may not be what really happens. And so there's this natural kind of, certainly in the United States, let's lean on the lawyers. They're going to design a contract situation, a relationship with these other parties that protects me, the CEO, it protects me, the board. I've got all of these wonderful things in place. No matter what happens, I'm okay. It's not true in cyber, right? So the company is still going to get hit. It still may make the news. You're still going to have a problem. And the way that the rules are being written, certainly coming out of Europe today, is that it's your responsibility no matter what that says. So we've got these strange transactor processor rules, and the way that data is moving in and out of companies, in and out of third parties. Your responsibility is there, no matter what the piece of paper says with the other party. You're going to see Google and others, they want to be the controller now of data so that they can hold all of that risk and not be worried about you. That's why they do that. Well, they do it so they can make money. But second, they're doing that because they can control the whole data relationship with the outside party and not have risk introduced by relying on third or even the first party when they're the third party, which gets kind of confusing. But that mindset of this piece of paper is going to protect me, that's leaving. So stress testing, knowing who you do business with, knowing all the way who you do business with is really key, and their impact on your constituents really matters.
So one last question, then I want to leave some room for questions from the audience on this topic of responsibility and responsibility shifting. And I'm not going to take my time to defend lawyers, which usually I actually spend most of my time defending chief information security officers or CISOs, because they really have become the fruit fly of the corporate board. I mean, company gets hit, they get fired. Company gets hit, they get fired, and then they move on to another company because the best qualification you have for being a CISO is being a CISO. And so, it's a bit of a awkward sort of governance and responsibility model. I think there are examples of companies that clearly have evolved past that. I think Accenture is maybe an example. And so I guess what I'd like to hear from each of you on is sort of a blank paper test around what should this governance and what should the responsibilities look like. If it's not hire a smart nerd until the company gets pwned and then fire him and move on, that's clearly probably not the most elegant solution to the problem. And it can't just be, hire lawyers, although as a lawyer, I'd love to hear more of that, but I also would argue that's definitely not the solution. I think we've talked about elements of it from board and other areas. I think we've seen companies that have strong distributed models around security, meaning where everyone plays a role, and I think those are good examples. So, I guess, do any of you have ideas on sort of what that right sort of corporate responsibility when it comes to physical security and or cybersecurity look like? or examples of where companies are doing it really well?
Yeah,
I'll pick, you're all friends, so I'll
in.
start picking on you.
From my standpoint, just again echoing what Bryson said, it's more than just on paper. It's a board commitment, it's management, but it's in practice, and practice can be verified through budgets. It can be to the points about stress testing. I'm a first responder. I've seen some people come out of the academy, to use the comment nerd, A's, could read you forward and backwards the medical protocols, the response protocols, and when you get out in the real world, they freeze. So contact, as you know from being in the military, has an entirely different meaning than what you get in the academy. And I think as we shift in security and it's come out of the back office, it's in the front office, getting the attention of the head office, doing that training, not just with security professionals, but also understanding how management's going to back that up. How is management going to show up? Because ultimately, to the point that you're making, the CISO today might be being blamed, but ultimately the responsibility rolls up to the organization, rolls up to the C-suite. And ultimately the board will hold them accountable. And I think that shift will come, especially when attacks start becoming more disruptive than just and destructive than they have been in the past.
The problem is you can't definitively measure security. You can't. I mean, we have ideas, we have opinions, we have lab results, and yet the attacker wins tomorrow. The way I describe our industry is we're really good at understanding yesterday and solving the problem and then getting surprised tomorrow, Groundhog Day. And that's fundamentally where the CISO is stuck in this position of attesting that there is some level of assurance that business operations will continue unaffected when there can be no guarantee, right? We can do, this is, we were talking earlier this morning, and I think the model that we apply is like the CFO. If the CFO focuses on process maturity, we see definable results. We see accounting that adds up, we see transparency, there is a clear result to process maturity. When the CISO focuses on process maturity, which makes sense, that's what you're supposed to do as an executive, you don't know what actually comes out of that, right? I have a better organization. I have multi-factor authentication. I have all of these other controls in place, and I have aware employees, and I have all the things right, and I can still lose. And so while it does improve things, it's improving it into an unknown against an attacker that it's really just a question of either opportunity cost or resource interest. And when we start looking at things now at a nation state level, and this is what I thought was interesting in the earlier conversation, it touched into something that Chris was saying earlier about transferring risk on paper. The insurance market was meant to be that ability to quantify that risk and put it on a piece of paper and go, no matter what happens, I've got my ladder of coverage and I'm good to go. And then what did we see? Well, that's an act of war. Denied. Because nation states are attacking private industry, and we have apparently defined that as acts of war. And so I think that does shift to the earlier panel where that level of responsibility should be in doing that, because at the end of the day, what else can private industry do than private contracts to try to quantify that risk that they can't effectively block to begin with?
Yeah, so I'm picking up on the insurance industry. It's coming. So they're learning more and more about what to do and sort of how to monetize effectively for themselves in kind of enforcing rules on their clients. But insurance is often looking at the entity and wondering, what are you going to do to others, right? And that mindset needs to carry on inside of the organization as well. I think a very, very tiny percentage of cyber thought at a company, even at the federal government level, is what am I doing to others? And if you want to learn about what's happening to you in digital, not just cyber, but in digital in general, you have to watch what you're doing to others. And when you understand what you're doing out into that digital realm, you're going to have a much better idea of what's happening to you, because it is one big, it isn't trite to say, it's one kind of big interconnected thing. That's the point of it, right? So if you understand what you're doing out, you're going to have a better idea looking inward too.
I think today's CISO, or the effective CISO, it's more than, there has to be care. in that are you hiring a CISO and expect your CISO to just manage and then take the blame? Or is the CISO an authoritative source on what the threat is, what the risk is, based on what our current posture is, right, for your organization? And so if it's the latter, which it should be, which it's evolving to more and more, then I think you're set up for success. I think it's bringing today's threat versus the risk that you have versus the posture that you have, and bringing that to the leadership of an organization and putting it into a context in which they can understand. And then that drives a conversation, that gets the funding, that gets you have your certifications to validate to them that you're doing, basic right things. But then you're also talking about what's changing and how you're flexing to that. And I think that's how you get the funding. That's how you get the funding to do the stress testing, and you continue from that. And I think that's what has changed. And, you separate that governance authority that the CISO has from a CIO perspective, et cetera. And if you have the right organizational elements, then I think you're on your path to some success in information security and cybersecurity.
So I do want to leave time for one question under the category of Beyond Cyber Vomit. So if anyone has any questions other than that topic, and if not, yep.
I'm Lena Leverchuk. I studied information systems at Interagency University. So we had about risk, kind of classification. I'm sorry, I'm late. Maybe you mentioned what kind of risk. Least 5. Customer or control all areas. It's just my about risk and past conflict. Everywhere we had risk or risk, not just one, can be grouped or categories or classifications or just that.
So I think the risk is different for every organization based on what they do. But that actually is really good, because what we do, at least, is we have our cyber threat intelligence organization, and we try to identify what's happening externally and internally, and grouping that into 5 key risks. And then we associate the controls that we have, the maturity of those controls, and how we feel we're able, the where we're at with those, right? And we get validation across from leaders of the organization to validate that we're looking at the right things in their eyes, and that our controls aren't, negatively impacting them or they are protecting them. And then we have the numbers to back that up as to how effective our controls are, right? And our controls are not just technical, it's training, et cetera, around people. And we look at the level of incidents and minor incidents even that people have versus trained versus non-trained, right? And we show that evidence, and that helps drive the conversation. Plus, it validates that we're looking, at least from when we validate that they agree with us, but it also informs them of what the risks are that we're managing. So I can't tell you exactly what the risks are, but we do categorize it, prioritize it, and then share that. And I think it helps just drive the conversation every day.
People, asterisk, suppliers. So the top 3 people, employees, the people asterisk is misconfiguration, and then suppliers extending your risk profile.
And the unpatched Linux servers, is that like number 9?
That's 3. That was 4 asterisks.
Person didn't patch it, right? So
misconfiguration. No, the patching thing. All right, never mind.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to move on to the next panel.
In the previous question, you mentioned risk a lot, similar to the context of the panel in terms of the industry and insurance. How would that relate back to the CFO model process you described, as well as going to different people to validate numbers?
I'll take the moderator's prerogative. And, CFOs really had a line of demarcation where the responsibility changed. It came when we passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And Sarbanes-Oxley to the CFOs in the world and online, changed their whole world. It went from, smart nerds or CPAs that were able to balance books and sometimes report those numbers out on a regular basis. If they were publicly traded companies, sometimes they would provide them, with some regularity to SEC. But Sarbanes-Oxley really changed the transparency in which financial accountability for large and publicly traded companies occurred. And we don't have anything like that in the CISO world, and that's where I think the CFO model is a useful one. Not that we need more, accounting nerds talking to cyber nerds, but I don't know if you guys think of it that differently.
But it took a huge crisis to come up with Sarbanes-Oxley. The cost of it was huge. So maybe we shouldn't wait for that kind of a cataclysm to happen again.
But we always do.
Yeah, and I should say I'm like having a little bit of cyber vomit saying that I'm holding Sarbanes-Oxley as an example of something I think we should emulate, because I don't think that's true, but I do use that as an example.
Well, we did have the wake-up call. That was, to me, that was the first of all, that was Aurora, and then that was the Target breach. No?
Well, I mean, I know we don't want to, but none of them have required change. I mean, we haven't nothing.
Oh, I don't mean regulatory change, but industry did respond after that. That was the first wake-up call where, the board was kind of like, wait, could that happen to us? I mean, that's what I mean. Yes, no, the U.S. government has not come and said, thou shalt have a cyber SOX, but, or Sarbanes-Oxley, but industry did respond to that. That was, I think, the first time that business finally got what was going to happen. And of course, not all businesses have come around to it, and regulation hasn't mandated that all businesses take it seriously, but there was a sea change.
Okay. And I think as insurance is studying these costs, right, so they're maturing along with it, the CFO has an opportunity to learn from the insurance company, keep the CISO out of the conversation a little bit just to learn what the external perspective is, and then bring it back and act as a partner inside of the organization. Right now, insurance should be that more than a set of confusion, which is just a dollar amount that I'm supposed to pay, wondering what am I going to get covered for. I think they're incented to bring education back into you. They have a lot of information. They're getting there, right? So I think that's a good place at the corporate level, not at the tactical kind of bits and bytes level, but at the corporate level to ask today as well. Certainly the big cyber underwriters.
So with that, I think I don't want to get behind schedule. So if we could thank our panelists, we're going to move on to the next panel.
Which one are you doing now? We're doing number 3? Yep. Number 3.
Yep, have a seat.
This one, I got the brief. Really smart. Yep. That's what I heard.
So we'll take a minute while people settle down. And online if you want to take a bio break.
The duty of care to educate.
Oh, this is really similar to what we just did.
So I'm not going to introduce the old panelists. In fact, we have 2 new ones, and I'll let them introduce themselves. But let me first, why don't we introduce Bruce starting, and then Peter, if you guys could introduce yourselves, and then we'll go on.
Sure. I'm Bruce McIndoe, president, one of the founders of a company called WorldAware, formerly iJet. My background is out of the technology and intelligence sphere, building systems to both protect and defend, as well as offensive systems to acquire. My current role is in a company just hit our 20th anniversary, and our job is to not rely on insurance that are largely economic protection, but figure out how to have continuous risk management around people, the locations in which they operate, supply, and information asset protection. And we'll talk more about that.
Good morning. I think it's still morning. I'm Peter O'Neill. I'm the CEO at ASIS International. We are an individual membership group, global group. We represent about 34,000 security management professionals around the world. I've been at ASIS about, 3.5 years, give or take. I do not have a security background by work. I have largely a business administration, political, public policy background. But I certainly learned a lot from our CSOs and our members globally in the last 3 or 4 years. So hopefully I will be able to make some sort of impact this morning. Thanks for having me.
Just for the people joining us on the interweb, if you guys want to continue with the introductions, just so they know who was on the panel. Tim?
So Tim Weir, former managing director at Accenture, and also a first responder. So,
Bryson Bort, I break things.
Linda Greenstone. I am a former prosecutor and former judge, now working in the due diligence area.
So this is the panel where I think we've hit to the end of bits and borders. I think we're sort of directly in the middle, or the sort of the corpus callosum between physical and cyber in some ways. Because here we're going to talk about, really what is the duty to care and to educate and protect personnel and customers in the digital domain. And really from that, we've had, and since we have both people that have served as sort of chief security officers and served purely in the sort of digital risk management area on the panel, and those that have sort of served on both sides, I really think there's a lot that can be learned, and that's sort of the central thesis for the panels today is how do we manage that sort of shifting change between physical and cybersecurity. And so I know we talked earlier about the fire marshals was brought up, and so I think when we think about the sort of the day jobs of CSOs, like Tim's previous day job, where on a given day you had to worry about natural disasters, kidnapping, robbery, and fires around the world, which even makes Bryson seemed like a glowing unicorn of a day, but thanks for the magic fingers. But when we start to think about how sort of companies have been able to manage, they've incorporated that risk in their daily basis. They can operate in countries that are have significant security threats, but they do that successfully. They do that in a fiscally responsible and socially responsible way. How do we bring that thinking into cyber? And so I guess the first part of that is understanding how do global companies manage that risk? And so I'd like to start with maybe Tim and Peter and Bruce, I guess to the right side, just purely geographically of the panel.
Seldom on the right.
Seldom on the right.
If we could talk about how companies.
I'm sensing the divide. Linda and I are on this side. That's cool.
Very good.
Well, I think you make a really good point about that. Some of the notes I made to myself while the other speakers were presenting this morning is that, look, from my vantage point, I'm both an insider and an outsider. I'm not a security management professional by training or by degree, but the last almost 4 years I've spent interacting globally with our leaders at all levels of security management. And I think one of the fundamental misunderstandings sometimes, at least from my perspective, is that the notion of, what is so-called enterprise security risk management, right, ESRM, that often people are so focused on the cyber piece, they miss the physical piece. And not just the physical security in the form of bombs and things like that, but one of the speakers this morning made the point that as corporations get better and better at cybersecurity, you've got physical infiltrations happening in order to get the information that they're looking to get. So I think there's a fallacy there that there's not an enterprise security risk management approach that needs to be, I think, looked at more seriously.
Sure. So I want to come and level set this conversation. We work with probably over 1,000 companies, most of them Global 2,000. So we talk about global companies and footprint and all of that. But through insurance companies, about 23 of them, we probably touch between 20 and 30,000 companies pretty much every day. And I'm going to have a voice for them because we have somewhere around 5.6 million businesses that have employers in the United States. 5.6 million. 99.7% of those companies have 500 or less employees. So roughly 5.4 million companies have less than 500 employees. Okay? And let's put it on the who's going to do this job. I can assure you they don't have a physical security manager. They buy some alarm systems, they get an alarm monitoring company and check the box. And when it goes to cyber, right now it's estimated that there's 2 to 3 million open positions for cybersecurity engineers and support and experts that don't exist. In the United States, I see it between 780, 1 million new positions that are open in the United States. So what do these 5.4 million companies do, whether they acknowledge it or not? And you mentioned this, it's like, where do I can't hire anybody. I want to do something about it. I'll go to maybe my telecommunications provider or maybe some company down the road to like do something. But it's like it's not there. More than 50% of the employment in the United States is in those companies. Target was what, an HVAC system provider, mechanical system provider. What's their investment? So I think this whole conversation about the divide, it's not only a divide between government and private, it's the haves in the sense of income inequality, i.e. profit, and those that don't have the resources to go after this. And if the government does not step up and support that domain of companies in the United States, we're never going to do this. I mean, Accenture struggles doing it with 400,000 people and millions of dollars to deal with this problem. So that's my appeal on this. And I can tell you, we have about 21 million people that we manage that move around the globe and work with them both in their physical and information protection. And again, you think about global businesses. Well, I'm talking about, a Maryland company that's importing products and their top leadership is running around the globe trying to do deals. So it's a 50-person company with 7 or 8 people running around to Russia and all through Southeast Asia. Okay, we provide them guidance. What can they actually do? It's like, you're telling me I can't take my phone and my laptop? Nah, that's not going to work. And off they go. So those are some of the challenges that I want to get out there and kind of put the numbers out there about how to make any of this work.
So Tim, maybe you can talk about, I guess, picking up on this sort of theme of this cyber poverty line. And so let's assume it's real, and I know Bryson and others have been advocating for us to think about that for a while. But under sort of for companies that manage global risk from a physical security perspective, was there a physical security poverty line? And if so, what were the sort of, how did you manage that? What were the tools you used? Because, in your previous role, companies were able to go work in lots of countries that had lots of security challenges, should we say. I'm sure you have a more colorful way of describing them. And so how did you manage that risk without sort of throwing up your hands and spending, putting your head under the pillow and never sleeping at night, which I'm sure you did all 3 of those things at some point?
It's a valid point that there is economies of scale when you're larger. Having siblings that are entrepreneurs, and recently spending some time with my brother, I realize he's the CEO, the CFO, Chief Risk Officer. He does outsource legal. But is he equipped? Does he understand if an actor is using the low-hanging fruit to perpetuate an attack? Maybe, maybe not. Does he have access to the resources that are out there? I think there's a lack of education for small business. I mean, are there resources? I mean, Peter's organization, there's a tremendous amount of guidelines, standards that and I was explaining to my brother, for example, that he could tap into. Even in large organizations, you bring up the target attack, but good cyber begins with great physical, and we have to leverage it out. We have to leverage organizations like WorldAware. You have to branch into the reality that whether you're large or small, if you're going to truly globally operate, there's going to be some unknown unknowns and some known unknowns. And what's the dividing line in between there? Because as Bruce said, you can't tell people you can't take your phone. You can't tell people you can't take your laptop. You can't say to the CEO, I'm going to shut down travel to a particular country because they're a hostile adversary, especially if there's a huge consumer base there. So to recap, I think there's going to be a divide because bigger organizations have more resources. There's ways bigger organizations can lend because they do work with smaller organizations, that expertise. But also I think governmental as well as organizationally, we can do a better job of explaining that there are these resources out there that are not cost prohibitive. GSX is a prime example. You can be a big company and you can be a one-man shop. You can get access to a tremendous amount of what's going on both in physical and cyber. And that needs to be better communicated out, especially to the entrepreneurial businesses that can impact the large businesses, because we're all dealing with them. If you're getting cookies, if you're getting HVAC, if you're getting deliveries, and we're living in an integrated society of supply chain that, as Bryson, you pointed out, something can go wrong very quickly if you're not watching the vendors. And it does, again, I'll reiterate what Bryson said, and I said earlier, it's people. You have to look across where those are. It's your employees, it's your customers, it's your threat environment that we spend a lot of time looking outside the fence, as we called it, and it's your vendors. I don't know if you want to add to that, Bryson.
Yeah, so I think the question of cyber versus physical is the wrong question. The goal of a hacker, a malicious hacker or criminal, because there's folks in our community who get upset if you just say hacker, is theft, right? If I can steal it by coming in and taking your wallet, then I'll do that. But it's a lot easier to be in some foreign country and do that over a computer, right? I don't have to be physically present. So what's changed is your thieves are no longer in your community. It's now the world. It's all about cost, efficiency of cost, right? Hackers have bosses. They are required to report to them and deliver results. If you work in North Korea, your job is whiskey and Ferraris for dear leader by getting hard currency. That's how you do it. It's very similar to the way the Soviets operated back during the Cold War. You needed hard currency to make action for your nation state, because you needed hard currency to be able to operate on the stage to make other things happen. So it's not about cyber, it's not about physical security, it's about how do I defend myself. And I would love to be able to change the paradigm where they have to come and physically test my security. I want them to try to do close action, because that is a much more costly requirement. To put somebody on the ground who's going to be able to carry out a physically dangerous operation, or to try to co-opt an insider threat by harvesting an asset, I want you to be operating on those terms versus today where you can get me through email. Do you know that email is 90 to 95% of how all attackers gain access to your enterprise? And the reason is, what's the cost difference to send one email versus 10 million emails? It's negligible. I can just keep doing it, and I'll get in. So let's take that off the table and make you physically have to break into my place to get it. Another funny thing. All right, so everyone here has, been pitched by a Nigerian prince. Yeah? Why didn't you click on it?
Because I knew.
You knew. And you've seen these, right? The emails are poorly worded and there's commas and this. Guess what? The scammer behind that email speaks perfect English. Why did he intentionally, or she, why did they intentionally provide this really poorly worded email for you to phish? You didn't click on it, but somebody does. They've just now self-selected themselves. If I sent it in perfect English, my chance of knowing who clicks on that, first of all, more people are going to click on it, but my harvest rate is going to be lower. If it's poorly worded, fewer people are going to click on it, but my harvest rate and success is going to go up because they're idiots. And that's how I get their savings accounts.
You're calling my mother an idiot. I'm kidding. It's
I feel like I'm in the middle here.
If the keyboard fits,
glad you sat there.
hey, you're on that side, okay? This is what's going to happen.
I think we need to bring the federal, the judiciary into this discussion.
We have a
so-
prosecutor.
She's on my side.
I know, I see that.
To that end, I spent a time overseas, and I had a strange job. That is a long story. But in any event, I had a gentleman who received one of those emails. And he said, I really want to help this person. And I said, why do you want to help this person? He said, well, in the email, I was told that if I help him, that he would give me $1 million. And I said, sir, of all the people that live on your block, we're not going to talk about your city, your neighborhood, just on your block, why do you think they picked you to send that email to you? And he goes, I hadn't really thought about that. And I said, if you give this person some money, do you realize what is going to happen to you in the end and the trickle-down effect of all of this? And so, like you said, most of the people in this room would not respond to that email, but there's so many people who would. And within a company, there are so many people who will click on a particular email because it looks like one that may have come from someone that they do in fact know. And then it eventually infects the entire company. So we definitely need to have more education. I think we need to start it very early, because now little kids are using computers. Little kids are using mom's cell phone. And a little kid could click on a email that they should not have opened that then eventually affects mom's company. So there, obviously education, and it needs to start at a very low level, and I'm talking about little kids and elementary school. So by the time they get to corporate America, they know 25 times over and over, no, you don't click on emails from people that you don't know. Or it is from an email address that you kind of recognize, but if you really look at the ending of it, it's not really your brother's email address. It's some other email address connected to it. I think that's where we have to start.
So, point back to the sort of physical security side. I mean, what are what are some of the, and maybe I'll pick on ASIS for a minute. Just
They're the right people to pick on.
yeah. There when you think about sort of when we've developed some of the first multinational companies that had to go into China and that had to go into Russia. What is the experience and sort of how has ASIS helped shepherd and train CSOs to sort of manage that duty of care and manage that duty of responsibility?
Well, I think primarily, I've got some CSO Center members in this room, so they can speak up if I've said something incorrectly or if there's more to add. Primarily, I think it's through the knowledge networks that we have, the cones of silence that people can share information and experiences in. Primarily through the CSO Center. We have other ways now that we do it. I'm just back from Southeast Asia, where we had a series of meetings where there was some very interesting information shared, very much Chatham House rules in the room, so to speak, but a lot of those CSOs walked away with knowledge and access to information they didn't have on their own, or in some ways they were calibrating what they thought they knew. So I think that those are important. Certainly standards and guidelines are important. That was brought up a little bit earlier today. We do have some standards and guidelines in this area, but as an outsider, I would observe that they're not strong enough. Part of the challenge with what I call capital S, capital G standards and guidelines, and that means when you truly put them through an ANSI or an ISO process, is they can just take so long. You've seen recently that ASIS has made a bit of a pivot where we're willing to write what I call lowercase g guidelines, where we go through an ANSI-like process, but we don't go through a full ANSI process, which allows us to put rigor in that approval process, but doesn't force us to go through all the appeals and all the things that standards and guidelines often go through. So I think those are primarily the two areas. The last one, and it's one that's been mentioned, is our annual global meeting, GSX, Global Security Exchange, will be in Atlanta next year. Regardless of size of company, to Tim's point, that really is the best place to come, in my opinion, to seek access to the knowledge and information that people need to Bruce's point, it's not the Fortune 1000s, right? The Fortune 1000s are going to get it or they're not. There's always going to be varying degrees on a spectrum of what resources, time and money they're willing to put towards cyber and or physical security. Those debates are had all day long. Really, we look at and we try to concentrate anymore on these smaller companies that just don't have the access. How does ASIS aggregate what we have in a cost-effective way? I'm running a business as much as it's a nonprofit. How do we aggregate what we have and get it out there in a way that these companies that Bruce wisely mentions has access to at least some of what the Accentures, the Microsofts, the Apples, et cetera, of the world have. So that's generally the role we see that we play.
Yeah, so physical security. Like I said, for the vast majority of companies in the United States, basic perimeter security with a 24/7 alarm monitoring is their physical security. Oh, and a lock with a key, hopefully. Where things fall apart is, for example, just basic serious things like gun carry laws in the United States, right? So can someone freely walk into your business, whether you're a hotel, meeting venue, a mall, a private business, with a gun? And across the United States, there is some black, and there's some white, which means, yes, you can, and then there's a lot of gray. Just one simple thing. Can somebody walk into your business with a dangerous weapon? And we can't get a federal standard across those kinds of things. And we're talking about protecting incoming bits on an internet cable that can destroy my business. We're not even in the game. So we've got to get on it.
I don't know if you have any comments on the enforcement or use of gun laws, but I do.
You want gun laws?
No.
Oh, no.
No. Moving back to cyber vomit. Tim, I guess I would, beyond, so building off of Peter's point, so, obviously when you were, ran security at Accenture, you had a great network of peers and others that you sort of used as a tool, but you also had things like gates and guards and fences, and you had to worry about people, and you also had to worry about the business. So what was what is the secret to the sauce of how you put that together? Is there a risk management approach that you think is sort of that allowed you to do that? Are there things that you focused on a daily basis? What were the sort of keys to the success you had there?
That's a good question. I mean, it's a team sport. So you've got to, one, understand no risk, no revenue. You've got to understand what you're in business to do. You've got to be with the business. You've got to be with your cross-support functions and realize that going into any of these situations, you need to have collaboration. To the earlier point, when you're doing testing and red teaming, it's cooperating and bringing in the other groups so that when crisis does hit, it's not the first time you're meeting. So, we used a lot of virtual communications. I've met Paul virtually a lot. I've met him literally today, but we were doing those kinds of things so that when you got the call at 2 a.m, it wasn't a time for introductions. Secondly, you had to leverage out, when you're covering 120 countries, you're not an expert in all of them by any stretch of the imagination. The asymmetrical risk, both at the borders, digitally or physically, are complex. The human component enters into a number of contingencies that you could turn on the news in just this last week between Hong Kong and Bolivia, which resonates well. My son, who's a dual citizen, happens to be here today, and we've had a lot of debates about Bolivia, where a lot of his family on my wife's side live, and these things hit businesses fast. You need to be able to leverage out to WorldAwares, to OSACs. In some cases, getting advice from the Department of Justice, understanding what the OFAC rules are, before you have these problems, knowing who to call at 2 in the morning. Evan and I went through a lot of rehearsals together as an advisor to our organization about what if this goes wrong? What will we do? But at the end of the day, plans are just that. To quote Eisenhower, it's all about planning. The best laid plans do become a problem. Don't make perfect an enemy of good. But I would sum it up in saying you've got to collaborate, you've got to talk to HR, you've got to talk to legal, you've got to talk to workplace or facilities, you've got to talk to your cyber counterparts. You have to understand what the business is trying to accomplish. I used to say we're in the know business. That's not N-O. We're in the K-N-O-W business. If you don't know, then you're going to have a no. And when you tell people no, that tends to create challenges or resistance. And neither is good, not when you're running a capitalist business. So,
Yeah, I think Tim makes such a great point there. I think, from my perspective, I think often when I see CSOs in particular or CISOs struggling with internal issues in terms of getting leadership's attention, very often it's, may I just candidly say, style or lack thereof. Very candidly, very often it's a leadership and communication issue. It's not an issue. And very frequently we field calls at the office and, for assistance, if you will, in helping a particular person maybe position or reposition a particular issue or a particular issue that they're getting ready to present to their board or perhaps to their C-suite or perhaps to even just their supervisor or their immediate C. But I do think there's a lot in the security management profession, a lot of room for improvement around leadership, understanding business. My wife works for a large consulting company and has had some interactions the last year or so with their chief security officer, a great guy, but she's basically had to tell him, I'm not looking for N-O, I'm looking for K-N-O-W, right? I'm looking to be told, like, our company has signed this piece of work. You telling me we can't do that now is inconsequential because it's done. It's been signed. Now, we need you to tell us how are we going to implement in a way that's safe and secure. So I think more CSOs, more security management leaders in general, not just CSOs, really need to do a better job at understanding the business, understanding what drives that business, and be in the K-N-O-W business, not in the N-O business, unless the N-O is truly needed. Like, save the N-O card for when it really is life and limb, or there really are serious reasons why, either cyber or physically, you wouldn't go do X. Yeah.
There's more yellow cards than red cards. The red cards are the NOs, and you've got to use them sparingly for truly life and death situations. But you've got to know how to use the yellow cards, finding resources like Linda's organization, Williams, that do the due diligence to help you define K-N-O-W so you can articulate it to people who are legitimately trying to make a profit. And I do believe the majority of people are trying to do what's right. There are ways to deal with the people that deviate from that, but it's a small percentage. But in your organization, collaborating with the going-in principle that they're trying to do something correctly, and that's why they're seeking your advice versus coming in with the adversarial view that they're inherently trying to break policy.
So the last point I'd like to talk about before I open up to the public, and this is to Tim's point, you've mentioned both OSAC and Linda's organization, and we've talked about the role of the Department of Justice. What, in terms of helping companies manage their sort of duty of care, what role does the government and what role can the government play? And let's sort of maybe start off with things they're doing right now. I don't know if everyone in the room knows what OSAC is and how it manages risk, and we can maybe talk about the role of the judiciary and the Justice Department and helping sort of what enforcement mechanisms can they have to help keep companies responsible for. But start off, Tim, since you used to live in the OSAC world, what is it and what do they do and how do they help industry?
So, I mean, I'll just make this comment before explaining OSAC. You in this room pay your taxes, and the good news is that some of that goes to wonderful resources that are out there to help, including the Department of State, Department of Justice, the FBI, and so forth, and some of the other organizations that we've worked with or worked for. But OSAC is the Overseas Advisory Council that it came together under George Shultz and the leadership that there was a need in the private industry and the public to come together. This was after a variety of threats that were occurring in the world back in the 80s. This was followed by the Lockerbie bombing, which was the no dual standard, the requirement that the intelligence community and the State Department not pass information just to government employees, but also to protect U.S. citizens. And there's a high priority placed on that. They have an excellent team that is dedicated daily to producing risk reports and getting that out. And that can be augmented with private intelligence companies like WorldAware and balanced to come up with a mixture of risk that's right for your organization. Understanding and knowing the relationships with the Department of Justice, understanding what OFAC and how those implications impact your business and ultimately your people, because at the end of the day, it's protecting people. Without people, you can't make revenue. Requires that, as I said, team sport, working with your legal team. Because if you protect people, but at the end of the day get yourself into a legal jeopardy that ultimately has a financial or a criminal consequence, revenue's lost. So there's two ways to lose people. It's either sending them into harm's way and they get hurt, which ultimately take the litigation out of that. You have to look at families. And I lived by a standard that I wouldn't send anybody anywhere I wouldn't send my own son. Or I wouldn't send anybody anywhere where I wouldn't show up first. When we went into Iraq, I was there. Secondarily, you want to make sure that you're working with your legal scholars and your outside and internal counsel, because you can cause problems on the backside and people lose jobs. When there's penalties, there's embarrassment, it impacts people's lives. So not to harp on what Bryson says, it's people, people, and people, and that's what matters. We're still people-centric. I don't know if you want to add anything to that one.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking, in preparation for this panel, I was thinking about, there was a San Bernardino, where the person had the telephone and the issue of whether or not Apple would give any information about getting into that telephone. And so then it becomes this corporate social responsibility. And I don't think our rules governing search and seizure have gone to the point of cyberware, because I could grant a search warrant to go to your home to look and see if there's any evidence of the crime that may have been committed in the home, but there's really not much of a standard of at what point can I force Apple to turn over that information. And we haven't gotten there yet. And I think that we need to get there because, like you said, I have more information on my cell phone than would be found in my home, definitely. And so at some point government does need to step in to set some rules there. And I think there are things that the government will do and has done that could go to corporations, to help corporations do a much better job of teaching their employees so that we don't have some of these issues.
So could you, before we go to Bryson, could you give some examples? I mean, I guess is this something that Congress just needs to pass better laws? Do judges need to, make better decisions? Do we need to have law firms bring better cases to you? Or, I mean, is it any of those things or all of those things?
I think it's a bit of all of those things, because there was a great need to get, just this one instance, there was a great need, or at least the investigators thought they needed that information. They needed to get into this particular cell phone. And Apple says, no, I'm not going to tell you how to get into that particular cell phone. Well, so right now we're just talking about an incident that happened in one state. Let's talk about, we have a cell phone with an alleged terrorist. And there's some information on this particular cell phone. How do we get the information that we need from that particular cell phone? And what type of warrant is necessary to get that? I'm sure you've dealt with wiretaps, and obviously in order to get a wiretap, it's much more stringent than to just go into someone's particular home, because there's always an expectation of privacy when you're having a telephone call, unless you're having it on the subway and you're speaking on speakerphone and everybody else can hear the conversation. There's no expectation of privacy on there. But yes, we have a great expectation of privacy on a telephone that I have to put a 4 or 6 digit number into to get it open, or I have to actually use my face to get it open, or I have to use a fingerprint to get it open. But have our laws caught up with the technology? in how we access that technology when the person that the telephone is now in custody, the owner of the phone is in custody or possibly dead, or if we don't open this telephone in the next 24 hours, there could be thousands of people who have lost their lives.
And I would add, Evan, too, I worked for Accenture, and it was a great company that put people first. And I think when you have that environment, you take it for granted that everybody else does that. Do there need to be more regulations? I'm not a big fan of regulations, and certainly some countries in Europe have gone to the extreme, like corporate manslaughter and other accountabilities for companies. But I would add that, unfortunately, to the earlier points, not all organizations put people first. There's probably a need to look, as we are probably heading towards a destructive cyber attack that will have physical ramifications across a number of spectrums, including the digital borders. And again, being a first responder, we know where the intersections are that needed traffic lights. And generally it took something to occur, a bad accident, to have the local municipality put up the traffic light. You can broaden that to what Bryson's saying. Are we going to wait for something that's going to cause a digital SAR box? Hopefully there's some balance in between. And again, it's great that there's organizations like Accenture that put people first and have ethics that do those things correctly. But we cannot live, to my earlier point, in denial, that river, that everyone's doing that out there today. And that is a risk, because at the end of the day, people have to be the priority focus.
Can I do, so
Yeah,
shameless
please.
plug, I'm actually speaking at OSAC on Wednesday on this topic.
And in full disclosure, I will be there probably as well.
Okay, he and I are both doing this.
I'll be there too.
Oh, the three.
Full disclosure.
You win?
I'll be there too.
All right.
4 of us. Everyone's
All right,
going to be
sorry,
outside.
now the divide's here.
And I guess to those in the room and online, I mean, I guess we do need to think about what is the cyber version of OSAC. It's an organization I've known for 20 years, that it's great and exists, but there is no corollary to how companies come together and think about sort of cyber global risk in that way right now. I think private sector is largely pulling them together, and the government's kind of watching. So I want to open up to questions in the room.
What are the most important infrastructure changes that are needed to improve physical and cybersecurity?
What do you mean by infrastructure?
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Well, I'll give you an example where it hasn't been done. Spam phone calls. I mean, there are technical solutions that have not been able to overcome the political roadblocks that have been around for years, and they haven't been implemented. But, I would say that's one major infrastructure improvement that's needed. What are some others?
I'm going to bridge the divide here, because we sorely lack any kind of consistent training and education for people, and I'm using people broadly. We do not have the concept of a digital citizen and what's expected of people around the use of this technology and information. That starts in the elementary schools and should continue through life. The government does awesome things like FEMA around the NIMS building training and guidelines and everything to help companies manage emergency response and incidents, to help communities manage that, so they put money into that. We lack any of that kind of infrastructure. I mean, there's some basic things that we should be doing for every citizen in this country to better manage their digital persona and their digital engagement.
I'll take the infrastructure thing literally. So DHS CISA has responsibility for critical infrastructure. And there's pending legislation, and whether you agree with the approach to subpoena authority or an alternate method, today, CISA does not have the ability to notify asset owners of vulnerable critical infrastructure that they find based on IP address. So whether you agree with the way it's being proposed or an alternate method, and there are other methods, the simple fact that they can see critical infrastructure, we're not talking about PCs in your business or PCs in your home, critical infrastructure assets, which by definition to me are a public good, they affect all of us, they can't even tell you just that, hey, there's a problem.
Well, I mean, there's in defense or in explanation of things, DHS, they weren't given the legal authority to protect critical infrastructure. If you look at sort of both the Homeland Security Act and the governing guidance they've received since then, it's really the lead and protect. And that is, you know, and there are other, for example, within the financial sector, it's the Treasury's Department to actually do more of the hands-on protecting. I think this is, I mean, back to some earlier discussions, you know, do we need to think about what the evolution of protecting critical infrastructure looks like, especially in light of sort of to the bits from the borders? You know, DHS was largely focused on physical security. We often call this the pendulum at the department between physical and cyber, or sometimes between natural disasters and terrorism during natural disaster and terrorism seasons. And so what we really, you know, I think are hitting on is that we haven't really figured out where this pendulum swings and what the middle state of it is. And so I think that's a good point and a real challenge. So any last points from the panel or questions from the audience, if there are any more? So if not, I'd like to thank the panelists.
I think you did have.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Go ahead.
With, you mentioned a public good, which brings in externalities, especially with FEMA not having access to a cell phone in case of a disaster, or the CISO not having access to an IP address. How would infrastructure help that, and how would that in turn move with public goods and externalities?
So I'll steal an idea from a friend in the audience. I mean, I think if we think about having a separate dedicated critical infrastructure to a set of sort of an internet for critical infrastructure, we could also have a separate internet for public need. This is something actually that when DHS was established, there was actually a budget associated with this. I think it was called CWIN at the time, and we have this in the telecom sector, where during an emergency, telecommunication providers and first responders like Tim get priority access to communication, and we are able to very sort of ably manage that. We haven't really thought that out, and we haven't really been able to implement building out a separate infrastructure that we need for either the critical infrastructure or the first responders or sort of a national security infrastructure. But that clearly is something that will either happen from a private perspective if we look at the evolution of where sort of cloud infrastructure, where we have, you know, now gov clouds, and we have, you know, these hybrid clouds that are clearly providing high priority service. I think that's the beginning steps of industry doing it. And eventually government's going to have to fund and come along, but I don't know if I've pissed off or said things disagreeable to people in the room or on the panel. So.
Perhaps everything shouldn't be on the internet? Yeah, I agree.
100% agree.
Okay.
We'll debate it later.
Well, let's thank the panelists, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break before the next panel. So thank you.
Thank you for doing that.
Good call.
Okay.
So if you wanted to mark yourself safe, family members of
Text.
that was it.
I couldn't agree more with what you said up there. Did you guys eat it? Yeah.
That's 2 to 3 million worldwide. Get a certificate and get a 6-digit.
Provides you the executive down to all the hackers to do it. The platform that allows you to operationalize any threat imaginable. Specify some characteristics that you're just in time build that threat for you. You can run it
not-for-profit has now instituted compulsory training courses for every employee. They learn not to click. You can't use your email until you take that course. Does that work?
No, it doesn't work for TV. What's next? So one of my favorite stories about Travis is last year I was talking to this asymmetrical, right? I want something to quantify something. And I was talking about how he started on the mission training and everyone's coming to it. They're still getting it, it doesn't matter. Second part is that that's just generic. You can get anybody to how smart they are. After craft the
One of the things about me on this device, it doesn't tell me the senders, doesn't print out the senders for email. And if somebody's spoofing from a friend's, you can't tell. Do security firms do phishing and when somebody clicks on a make-believe fish, block their email?
No, you can't do that because you've now affected privacy. Nobody will ever allow you to potentially affect operations. So it's not that, hey, this represented X threat.
So what do? Just go back there and say, oh, you didn't know that. I'm not sure, which choice I would have made. I think I would have blocked them at least temporarily.
So the first thing what I always recommend, doesn't matter. Not everybody in the company matters. Not everything that's in your company matters. Identify what does and look about what kind of controls we put on. Something like that does click on an email. Establish that control. Don't click on the person. People are never really going to fail.
Physical security, because you're not going to worry about the computer in his home in the early days. Broke into his home. And there it all was.
Well, see, for me, you want to shift that to that posture. That's somebody who really wants to make it. That's the kind of adversary that you're facing. Then you're winning. No, they'll forget you, but you've made it very expensive for them. They have to really want to.
It didn't matter what your name was. So I think we'll assemble our new speakers.
Hey, Chris.
Who's moderating? I don't like to be near the moderator. Why can't I sit next to you? It's the only kind of diversity we have.
I was saying that mockingly, to be honest.
So we're wrapping up on panel 4. We'll just do some quick introductions of who's on the panel. Just run down the line again, name and serial number.
Yeah, Bruce McIndoe, president, founder of WorldAware.
Paul Kunis, managing director at Accenture.
Chris Olson, CEO and founder at the Media Trust.
Rob Kanaki, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Evan Wolf, CISO Whisperer. Partner at Kroll and Waring as well.
And this is Tim Weir, former managing director of at Accenture. So we're going to be talking on 2 topics here, red teaming and then the blue sky thinking of what's on the horizon. But we're going to approach red teaming not just as to what companies do, but in our paper that Evan and I worked on, we talked a little bit about the shift from pure profit motivation to weighing the corporate social responsibility. Outside the fence, are we thinking about what just happens to the company or what happens to the community that we exist when things are being factored in? So to the extent, I think, Bruce, you have a unique perspective because of the footprint of companies that you represent, Paul, the wide swath of countries that Accenture operates and the large employer that it is. And then certainly our other panelists of inside perspectives on how government in particular thinks. And then try to keep in mind, we highlighted Henry Paulson about a year ago in the Financial Times in an op-ed. Government and business have different goals, divergent incentives, and answer to distinct constituencies. But increasingly, companies are being looked at as corporate citizens. So when we think about red teaming, to the extent that you can share, how is that factoring in to your company drills? Tabletops are just that flat. So why don't we start maybe with Paul, and then we'll jump around a little bit.
Well, sure, but at Accenture, so I'll reiterate, right? We understand both our commitment to our clients, our legal responsibilities, but then there's also the ethical responsibility and how we lead in the entire cyber ecosystem, or help to lead. And I think that comes back from knowledge sharing. And where do we get some of our knowledge? What we are able to do is augment what we do just from a cyber control perspective with a red teaming. And this is a team that works out of our security incident response team. And they practice simulations within our environments, and they will sit next to our first responders, and they will execute these drills. And they will test and stress test our systems to validate that our controls are functioning, and not only our controls, but really our processes. So are the right people notified if something is identified? Are the teams that are actually monitoring, identifying the issues? And so we do a full spectrum of with deep skilled individuals with parameters on how they drill, et cetera, but we have findings, and we have those findings, and then we take corrective actions. Similar with that, we have a threat hunting team, right? So not only do we simulate what threat actors do with our red team, but we then identify through our threat intelligence what's actually out there, and then we can go and hunt proactively to see if we've missed it with any of our standard tools and monitoring processes. So what we get is we learn from that, and we augment our policies, our standards, our processes, our tools, our education, our people, et cetera, and we improve on that. And then from that ecosystem perspective, we have relationships now with our clients, with our suppliers, with law enforcement, and we share our knowledge where we can. And we're looking to do that more and more because we know that we have an ethical responsibility. For instance, when there's an issue with a service provider, it might not be Accenture, but it takes a lot of time and resources for us to convince our clients that we are not susceptible as well. And we'll use some of this knowledge that we have as evidence of how we've maybe proactively addressed it through a hunt or through a simulation with our red team. And so we can have that conversation, and then they'll learn from that, and then maybe that will get them to understand that they have to have threat intelligence. They need to do the testing, et cetera. So, it kind of rolls out like a pebble in a pond, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Bruce, do you want to share any insights on what you're seeing across the spectrum with your clients?
Again, with the spectrum that we have, it varies from what's a tabletop to full scale, full on, multi-dimensional red team, testing of systems and processes, much like Accenture's talking about. The challenge, again, for most organizations is time and money, in doing it. And so I would say, our top clients, that Global 2000, are fully committed to it. I don't know if it was Rob or who said, about the cloud being just somebody else's computer. Well, largely Accenture is somebody else's computer and in their BPO business. And yes, they are more than acutely interested in, your cybersecurity posture and those kinds of things. So, yeah, it's a real challenge. A multinational tabletop exercise with actual procedural execution is in the $50,000 to $100,000 range, and that is a big ticket item for companies. And so then they will do maybe around the tabletop, and then when something happens, somebody says, "How do you use that software? Or who has the login?" And it's pretty much end of story right there. So it is a challenge. It's all over the place.
And do you see organizations factoring in the digital borders and multilateral implications, or are they still singularly focused on where their headquarters are? Are we starting to see more virtual?
No, totally, especially with our largest multinationals. These are the largest companies in the world. They are struggling due to a vacuum of global governance and definitely around the cyberspace, but all just existential threats to humanity, nuclear destruction, climate change, and technological innovation tend to be the areas that they focus on. The latter two are in the news most recently. And these multinational corporations are having discourse about what is their responsibility to preserve their markets. And you're seeing more CEOs of these companies, especially in the technology domain, leaning forward and pushing on those topics. And that's a dangerous position to be in, as we've seen. So again, we struggle with national boundary governance around cybersecurity and technology. We stink at global governance, and and unfortunately, I forget who was saying, it's going to take a cataclysmic event to polarize the world to stand up and create a UN for cyber. Unfortunately,
UN or NATO?
Our NATO would probably be more effective if they're funded. But anyway, I'm just saying is that so companies for self-preservation are actually having these same conversations.
Chris, how does a company test with so many variables right now?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question to ask me. So we advocate for continuous monitoring, and across many of these things, that's not, especially physical, that's not possible. But certainly gathering information that would be feeding red teams as red teams become augmented by, I don't know about AI, maybe not that far, but automated methods of gleaning what's interesting. That's very important. But we also see that in order to understand your digital environment, you have to behave like those that are either touching your digital environment or those you're trying to influence. You can see it inside of disinformation. Today it's moved from the Facebook platform as Facebook has shut down billions of fake accounts to Instagram, and they're affecting it there, and now moving that off to kind of traditional media, your CNNs and Foxes of the world, and leveraging targeting. And so targeting is huge in cyber. You have to be able to look at things the way that your constituencies act, but also an understanding of the adversary and what they're trying to target. And so testing more and more as different kind of parties and capabilities is really critical to kind of see what's happening.
Rob, do you have any additions to that?
I'm going to pass on this one.
Okay. Evan?
It's two quick things. I think everything that we said is good, but the back end of any offensive testing is, from my perspective, where all the risk is managed and created. And that's what companies sometimes forget. So it's great to have, even the best company or identify what malware's on your website or what vulnerabilities you have in your network. But if you don't have a sort of a team approach to how you mitigate and manage it, you're actually could be creating more risk for the company, because bad red teaming reports that sit around until you're in the middle of a transaction or you get hit by a bigger event and you have to produce that during some sort of litigation happens far too often and creates a lot of risk. And the last piece is that, this is still sort of in the sort of touchy-feely, sort of voluntary, companies can do this, it's not required. And we need to think about, what we got out of the financial crisis with the TARP program. Once again, a little nauseous saying that the TARP program is something I'm saying we should emulate. But we got some really good tools out of that crisis. There's always this, don't let a crisis go to waste. And now we have financial stress tests. Our banks are more secure now and more resilient now than they were beforehand. And so we need to think about proactively, while we have the time now, how we take sort of this concepts of red teaming or offensive testing, both of not only networks, but of software. We haven't really talked about software, but that's another aspect of what we need to be thinking about. It's not just sort of the networks that the private companies are responsible for, or their websites, or their projections to the internet, but also the software that we're developing, and think about what are the, what does a TARP program look like for the cyber industry?
Software is a key element. Everyone has run to SaaS, right? The cloud hosting of applications to run their business. It's no longer on your PC. Who's watching that hen house, right? Salesforce.com goes toes up for 24, 48 hours for whatever reason. How many thousands, tens of thousands of businesses would be impacted? So again, having some level of certification and standards and expectations of these providers that we can agree on and have faith in would be widely desirable.
And being sensitive to time, before we go to what's on the horizon, let me ask the question. It's voluntary to test and red team now within private industry.
Totally.
Does it need to be mandated?
I don't know if it needs to be mandated. I'll let the lawyers answer that one. But I think you need to consider, though, if it is, what you're asking and who it's applied to. Because some organizations like an Accenture, we can do that. We do that already, right? But there's going to be organizations or industries that it's just not going to be beneficial because they haven't even built a program yet that's sufficient to actually stress test. Because then you're going to be, then they'll, you have to be able to do something with the information, right? And make a change in the positive. So I think you need to, I think you're really going to benefit once you actually have the basics in place and it's operational, and then you can stress test. So there's just got to be some thinking of, once you make it, it could actually have a negative effect if it's not done right.
Rob probably have a point on this, but again, those companies that are providing technology services for the public good, like I talked about, applications to run business, banking, water, power, yes, it should be mandated.
Well, there's fire code, there's base standards when you go to the hotels at night. That evolved. That wasn't always there even 80 years ago. And to these points on critical infrastructure that's largely in the private sector hands, and I'll turn this to Rob, and do we need to get the Congress and others to start thinking about some baselines that the average taxpayer can have some comfort to know that, like at the hotel last night, that at least there's working smoke detectors?
So, I think I'm actually going to reverse that. One of the challenges we've had with arguments for regulation is we don't really have metrics that show that implementing standards works, right? We don't know how to measure security. We don't know that the best practices that are community agreed to and evolved standards actually reduce risk. So red teaming is actually probably the better approach to regulating because it's outcome based. If you look at the nuclear industry, the way the nuclear industry does this is there's a design basis threat that nuclear power plants have to be able to prove they can defeat. That's essentially a red teaming exercise. How you do that may involve incorporating various standards for, in the physical world, your perimeter defense, your detection technologies, your response time. But provably being able to defeat the adversary is actually an outcome-based way to do security. And I think that that is actually a better approach than saying, here are the standards you need to meet. If you talk to many people on the offensive side, they say, you know, give me a standard that tells me how high the fence needs to be. That tells me how tall my ladder needs to be. And so that's used as an argument against regulating. I think it actually indicates that we need a better way to regulate that is more outcome-based. And red teaming, I think, is certainly one way to do that.
I think for critical infrastructure, I think it's an easier conversation. I think if you're talking about industry, corporate, then you need to start talking about if it's regulated, who performs the red team exercise. Because when we do it internally, we have a level of trust, right? And I think that just has to be part of the equation of who would do it.
Evan, thoughts there?
I mean, I agree with what was said, so I'll pass for now.
All right, so let's, using the lightning round of Kramer, with the remaining 15 minutes, we'll leave a little bit to questions, but what is on the horizon? So why don't we start at the end and move towards me? Give us a 4-minute view. What do you think is on the horizon? What are the unknowns we should be looking at?
So I mean, I think under this concept of operational collaboration, I think there's sort of 4 areas that we're going to see change, and the first is, and I'm a lawyer, so I guess you know eat where your house is, and so it's going to be legal and regulatory. We are going to continue to see, as we're seeing in the defense sector, as we're beginning to see the litigation now that we have sort of private right of actions under 2 laws, one for all of Europe under the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, and then emerging in California under the California Consumer Privacy Act. They are specifically getting over where the courts were getting stuck, which is the issue of jurisdiction, and so now the judiciary is saying, now Congress and the California and the EU are saying, we want to use the courts as a way of enforcing and making better cyber requirements. So I think we are going to now be forced into thinking about a federal data breach law and really right-sizing some of the things we talked about today and roles and responsibilities. What is a government responsible to do and what is industry responsible to? I don't know if we can get there without legislation. I'm not using the R word that Rob was talking about, regulation. I think legislation needs to be a part of this, and we need to assign responsibility. I think the other 3 things just quickly are, we need to think about a better governance model. I think we've talked about today a lot about what is the role of industry versus government, and I don't think we have it right. And I think I had a recently interview, I guess a couple years ago, a bunch of CISO, Chief Information Officers and Chief Information Security Officers within the federal government, and the only thing they had in common was their differences, and I would argue to some degree some of their sort of how unqualified they were for some portions of their job. And we need to create real roles for what is a CISO, what is a CIO, and assign sort of clear standards of responsibility, and not make them accountable for protecting everything always, because that's not realistic. Third, I think we really need to think about where is the technology platform going to protect infrastructure. I think we all argue that the best thing, at least the cyber world would argue, one of the best things we have out there right now is protecting endpoints, which is the computers and the workstations. That's wonderful. But we really need to think about what does that mean to protect an endpoint versus protecting a network, and thinking about where these sort of solutions are going. And last, we need to have an operational collaboration a plan. We, when Rob was in government, he worked on the National Incident Response Plan, and that was great. but that doesn't really bring in industry. And so I think we need to have plans that are sort of sector-based of how does industry and government operationally share information, defend and attack networks, all in not human time, but in cyber time.
So I want to sort of, for my last comments, come back to something I talked about earlier, which is that I think in 5 to 10 years, we're going to look back and we're going to see that the global internet really has split apart into blocks of national internets. This is happening already. Bryson referenced Russia, China. China is exporting that model to at least 20 countries at this point in active talks all over Southeast Asia and all over Africa for how to construct a national internet, how to use it as the backbone for a surveillance society. This is their model of the internet. It's very different from the open, interoperable, secure, and reliable global internet that the U.S. has pushed for, that the U.S. has envisioned. And so I think this is something that we've got to really start taking seriously and try to accept at one level and push back on another. We need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that information will freely flow across the internet and it will change the societies where it comes into contact. That just simply has proven not to be the case. Authoritarian regimes are going to use the internet for their purposes, for very different purposes than we want it used for. No amount of wishful thinking is going to change that. And so, to come back to my earlier point, I would say the thing that we've got to do if we want to shape the internet over the 10 years in the direction that we in the West want to see it develop, we've got to actively engage on a different model and try and bring together like-minded countries.
So I'd follow on both of those in that I think if you take it up or down a level, whichever direction you want to go, from the internet to the World Wide Web and the mobile web, which is the place where most consumers are kind of touching and accessing all of this internet stuff. The beginnings with GDPR, wherever CCPA and other locale kind of regime ideas are going to go, it's our gut reaction to anybody putting any source code on any device. And that idea is going to start to go away over the next 5 to 10 years. It's going to be very strange that you would go to an app or a website where that company has no idea what they're taking and enabling to put on your device. Whereas today, it's complete Wild West. Generally, companies don't know what they do to you. That's unacceptable in a GDPR world, although the implementation of that is far from being realized. I think that's unstoppable. I think that's going to be too strong with politicians. I think there's too many state AGs that want to become the governor. You used to use COPPA, so Children's Online Privacy Acts, to become the governor, right? You'd sue the company that was putting that fourth-party code in front of the child and get Mattel in trouble instead of you. I think that's going to translate to the general World Wide Web and mobile web. And so surveillance rules, which will exist, I think, more and more and more in a place like China versus the, hopefully in Western societies where that all kind of lives inside of third-party code in external companies. That's going to be realized, and you'll see a better kind of cyber safety in the World Wide Web and mobile web because of an ethical constraint that's going to be laid upon us. So.
Yeah, just to build on what each of these gentlemen said, legal, cloud are going to continue to be an issue. I think the Internet of Things and life safety and just everything mechanical moving to digital now is a very big concern. And we need to consider that. But I think having that knowledge or that understanding of that context helps our cause, right?
Like I said, a bigger mega trend is the kind of next great transformation of our work and societies and culture as we deploy robotics, artificial intelligence / machine learning. That's going to be marching along in the next 20 years. So we're going to look back here in 10 years and say, this was easy. And we're all sitting here saying, this is hard, Mr. Doom, wherever he went to. But what the problem is that it's for good or evil. And what I'm seeing is bad actors, just like all of our jobs will be augmented with AI and many with robotics or eliminated with robotics. So is the hacker, the thief. And so what's happening is they're able to multiply their capability. They're able to go out and sense data and do adaptive modeling as far as how they want to attack and identify attacks, and just do that at machine speed. So where does the human sit in this? Because the defenders are going to be doing the same thing. And so I'm, where Rob and others are, if we don't have a multi-rail internet to protect those operations like critical infrastructure, like we do in defense and intelligence, we should do in business, we need that, but we also need the ability to manage that with some level of governance and responsibility, so that we have some prayer of kind of keeping this thing under control.
So we have time for one or two questions before we wrap up. Okay.
So that was great. Thanks. This goes to one of the comments that you made about what China is doing. When we talk about emerging technology areas, so not really things that are off in the future, but things that are really a question of availability or maturity of the technology. So when we think of like 5G networks, for example, we're still kind of going towards that here or in Europe. But this is also true for other markets that might be able to take advantage of early, buggy, not so sophisticated forms of this. So what happens, how does the landscape start to change when something like a state in India or a country in Eastern Europe or a place like, a market or a country like Ghana starts to implement a 5G network or some kind of an emerging technology? How does that shift the landscape?
Well, I mean, I think this is where, if we are similar to how countries, Ghana could take a international loan, and it could take a loan from China, and that loan could have certain requirements in terms of financial accountability and disclosures and long-term requirements that could really change the trajectory of the Ghanaian economy. And I think 5G is similar in that we're making countries and companies are making these long-term investments, and if they're making it with countries and infrastructure companies that are ultimately going to have, as we heard earlier from the analysis of the 2017 Chinese Cybersecurity Act, their loyalties never by law, they're required to defend the China, not Ghana in this example, or any individual company. And so we need to have some system in order to show that transparency, and that's why I am very concerned about what's happening with 5G. I really wish we did have it back to this USTR for cyber that would allow for us to have these sort of global rules of an enforcement around some of these ideas. I think the US and the UK and some of our other allies are coming around to make the right decision around how we want to implement and whether or not what partners we're going to use to implement our next wireless technology that is going to give away our sort of fundamentally going to be the backbone of industry for the next 20 years or so.
Any closing comments by the panel? Any final thoughts on that question?
I think there's a dirty phrase in Washington called industrial policy, but I think that's what your question and Evan's answer is getting at. And is this something the United States do and should do for the next generation of technology? I think what we're seeing is a less top-down but bottom-up approach to some of these solutions coming out of government, where the focus on supply chain security is going to, one way or another, drive very different technology development requirements than in the past. I think the days of build once, sell globally are coming to an end, whether companies want to admit that or not. But I spent some time with a very large electronics manufacturer last week who are totally convinced that in 10 years they're going to need to have completely separate supply chains for the Chinese market and for the US market. And there's no way that the US Defense Department's supply chain is going to run through China anymore. That's going to be a very different world than the world we've lived in since the 1990s.
And I'd add to that supply chain is that the information supply chain is going to fall into that as well. So depending on the direction it goes, if it stays as it is today, there's sort of an infinite surveillance architecture that gets bigger every day. If you look at sheer mass of software and source code that renders across the internet, and more of that is surveillance, whether it's a platform that's a U.S. mega billion-dollar company that's really awesome at it, or a state actor, and you'll see those things bifurcate as well, simply because taking information from external parties is going to be unacceptable, depending on where you're sitting, and that influence today is ubiquitous versus, it's the rule versus something else that we wouldn't be expecting to happen.
Well, on behalf of the Wilson Center, for those who joined in person and online and our panelists, we want to say thank you, and we'll be continuing this discussion and get together at another time for another forum. Take care.